A millionaire trapped in his own routine didn't realize he was forgetting his triplet's birthday every year, but the arrival of a new nanny reveals a painful silence he never saw inside his own home. She is the one who provokes the rupture by showing the father the loneliness the girls faced with every birthday candle blown out alone. And what he sees that day makes him collapse in tears, forever changing his relationship with his daughters. The alarm clock rang at 5 in the morning with its usual punctuality. Richard Thompson extended his arm and shut off the device. Before even fully opening his eyes, a gesture as automated as breathing, he rose from the king-size bed without a sound, crossed the spacious room towards the walk-in closet, and chose one of the 15 Italian suits hanging in chromatic order. The left side of the closet was untouched, the women's clothes perfectly arranged, waiting for an owner who rarely appeared. The 3-story mansion in the most exclusive area of the Upper East Side, New York City, remained in absolute silence as Richard prepared for another day. His footsteps echoed through the hallway of imported marble, down the stairs with a mahogany banister, through the living rooms decorated by renowned designers he barely noticed. Everything was always impeccable, organized, cold. The housekeeper had already left coffee prepared in the breakfast nook, but Richard never had coffee at home. He preferred to handle pending matters in the car on the way to the office. As he adjusted his tie in front of the entryway mirror, a discreet shadow moved on the upper floor. 3 pairs of eyes watched through the railings of the main staircase, small hands gripping the wrought iron bars. Emily, Claire, and Lucy were 5 years old and already knew this was the closest they would get to their father all day. They made no noise, didn't call out, just watched in silence. It was a routine learned since they could understand that some things simply didn't change, no matter how much they wished they would. Richard picked up his leather briefcase, checked the Swiss watch on his wrist, and walked out the front door without looking back. The driver was already waiting with the car running. The door closed with a soft, definitive click. Upstairs, the 3 girls sighed in unison, slowly went back to their rooms, and waited for the nanny of the moment to wake them for another day identical to the last. Thompson Constructions occupied 3 entire floors of a skyscraper on Park Avenue. Richard had transformed the medium-sized family business into one of the country's largest civil construction conglomerates. Malls, luxury condominiums, commercial towers, each project carried the surname he honored above all else, or almost anything else. He entered his office at 6:15 in the morning, greeted his team with mechanical nods, and dove into spreadsheets, contracts, and growth projections until his body demanded a break that rarely came before 10 at night. During a particularly tense meeting about a delayed development, Richard's cell phone vibrated. It was Beatrice, his wife, or rather, the woman with whom he shared a surname and a house, but little else. He dismissed the call. She called again. Richard excused himself from the engineers and answered with the poorly concealed irritation of someone being interrupted during something important. Beatrice informed him that she would need to extend her business trip in London for another 2 weeks. Unpostponable meetings, international contracts, opportunities that couldn't be missed. Richard responded with monosyllables, hung up, and returned to the meeting as if nothing had happened. He didn't ask about his daughters. She didn't mention them. That's how it had worked between them for years, a tacit agreement of courteous indifference. The house continued to function like a well-oiled machine, even in the absence of its owners. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, commanded the staff with a firm hand. Everything had a schedule, a protocol, an established order. The girls woke up at 7, were bathed with the nanny's help, dressed in the uniforms of the most expensive private school in the city, and ate breakfast at the dining table that could seat 16. The 3 of them occupied just one corner, small figures in a space disproportionately large for their needs. The current nanny, Sarah, was the 5th in 2 years. She came from an agency specializing in caregivers for high-net-worth families, had an impeccable resume, and treated her job with the cold efficiency of someone executing tasks, not caring for people. She checked if the girls ate, if they did their homework, if they brushed their teeth, if they went to bed on time. Once the checklist of duties was complete, she spent the rest of her time on her phone, or chatting with the other staff about absent employers and problem children who were no problem at all, just invisible. Emily, the eldest by 7 minutes, had developed the habit of organizing everything. She arranged her sister's toys, made sure Claire didn't forget her school supplies, and ensured Lucy finished her dinner. She had taken on responsibilities no 5-year-old should carry, but someone had to keep things in order in that house where the responsible adults existed only in theory. Claire was the dreamer. She would spend hours drawing families on sheets of printer paper she snuck from her father's home office. She always drew 4 people holding hands, but the space for the father figure was often left blank or hastily scribbled over when someone approached. She kept the drawings under her mattress, a growing collection of unfulfilled wishes transformed into colorful crayon strokes. Lucy, the youngest, was the quietest of the 3. She observed everything with large, dark eyes that seemed to understand far more than a child her age should. She rarely cried, rarely complained, simply existed in a state of melancholic acceptance that would have worried any adult who was truly paying attention. But no one was. The Triplets' room was a paradise of childhood consumerism. Shelves overflowed with imported toys, stuffed animals as big as they were, a 3-story dollhouse that was a miniature replica of their own mansion, a wardrobe filled with designer clothes that still had tags on them. Everything was purchased by personal assistants, following generic lists of appropriate gifts for wealthy girls. The Triplets played, but there was something performative about their games, as if they were acting out what was expected of them rather than what they genuinely wanted to do. At school, the teachers praised the exemplary behavior of the 3. Polite, obedient, always with their homework done and supplies complete. What they didn't notice, or chose not to, was that the girls didn't interact much with other children. They stayed together during recess, sitting under a tree, talking quietly among themselves, or just watching their classmates run and shout with a freedom that seemed foreign. Richard only became aware of his daughter's school routine through monthly reports that his secretary summarized in bullet points. Satisfactory academic performance, appropriate behavior, no incidents requiring parental attention. He signed the documents without reading, transferred the tuition payments, and considered his part. Done. Expensive education, elite school, impeccable uniforms. What more could a child need? On the rare occasions Beatrice was in New York, she organized dinners for important clients or charity events for high society. The Triplets were summoned to make brief appearances, always in matching outfits, always smiling. Perfect little dolls who greeted the guests with rehearsed curtsies before being sent back to their rooms. The guests would comment on how well-behaved they were, how lucky they were to have such poised daughters. Beatrice accepted the compliments with smiles and canned phrases about quality education and investing in the future. At night, after Sarah put the 3 to bed and went down to her staff room on the ground floor, the girls would often talk in the dark. Emily in the middle, Claire on the right, Lucy on the left, the 3 in their individual beds perfectly made with Egyptian cotton sheets. On that specific night, Claire broke the silence with the small, hopeful voice she used when she wanted to believe in something impossible. She said that maybe on their next birthday, their father would remember. Maybe he would come home early, maybe he would sing happy birthday with them. Maybe it would be different this time. Emily responded with the harsh practicality of someone who had learned not to be disappointed. She said it wasn't worth waiting, that it was better not to even think about it. Lucy said nothing, just turned on her side and hugged her pillow. Their birthday was 3 weeks away. It would be their 6th. For the previous 5, the celebration had been identical. An expensive cake ordered from a renowned bakery, candles lit by the nanny of the moment, happy birthday sung by the staff, photos taken and sent to Richard, and Beatrice as proof that the date had been duly registered. The Triplets would blow out the candles alone, cut the first slice of cake for the obligatory photographs, and then return to their normal routine. It was a non-event, a formality carried out without soul or meaning. Richard never questioned the system. He would receive the photos on his phone while in a meeting or closing a deal, quickly view the images of 3 smiling girls in front of a decorated cake, and mentally file it away as another completed task. He didn't notice that the girls never showed genuine joy in those photos, that their smiles were mechanical, that their eyes didn't shine with happiness but with resignation. Sarah gave her notice the following Monday. She had received a better offer, a family that paid more and offered superior benefits. Mrs. Gable informed Richard via text message. He authorized the termination of her contract and asked that a replacement be arranged through the usual agency. It was a standard procedure. It happened regularly, not even worth the trouble of in-person interviews. The agency, however, was having trouble finding available professionals with the usually requested profile. The experienced caregivers specializing in high-net-worth families were all employed. After 3 days of searching, the agency coordinator suggested an alternative. A young woman, not the usual profile, but with excellent references from other families and immediate availability. Richard, impatient with the delay and needing to resolve the issue quickly, authorized it without further questions. As long as someone filled the position and kept the routine running, the details were irrelevant. That's how Julia Miller arrived at the Thompson mansion on a rainy Thursday in June. She carried a worn backpack and wore simple but clean, well-cared-for clothes. She came from Queens, from a large family where she was the eldest of 5 siblings. She needed the job not to build her resume, but to help pay the bills at home after her father had an accident and was unable to work. She didn't have the polish of the previous nannies, didn't speak fluent French, didn't have a degree in education, but she had something all the others lacked. She saw children where the others saw just another job. Mrs. Gable received Julia with the procedural efficiency of someone who had done this dozens of times. She showed her the staff room on the ground floor, small but comfortable, explained the house schedule, the rules of conduct, the employer's expectations. Julia listened attentively, asking pointed questions, mentally organizing the information. When the housekeeper mentioned that the master of the house was rarely home and that the mistress traveled constantly, Julia felt a tightness in her chest that she chose to ignore. It wasn't her place to judge, only to work. The triplets were in their room when Julia went up to meet them for the first time. Mrs. Gable knocked on the door and announced the new nanny with the same formality she would announce the arrival of a package. The 3 girls stood up from where they were. Emily from a desk where she was pretending to do homework, Claire from the rug where she was drawing, Lucy from the window where she was watching the street. They stood in a line, hands clasped in front of them, perfect posture, polite but emotionless faces. Julia felt something twist in her stomach at the sight. They were 5-year-old children behaving like executives in a corporate meeting. She knelt to be at their eye level and smiled with genuine warmth. She introduced herself slowly, asked each of their names, complimented their beautiful room and the scattered drawings. Claire was the first to react, a slight gleam in her eyes, when Julia picked up one of her drawings and commented on the chosen colors. Emily minimally relaxed her rigid posture. Lucy continued to watch in silence, but something in the intensity of her gaze shifted. In the first few days, Julia limited herself to observing. She woke the girls, helped with their baths and breakfast, took them to and from school, supervised homework, served dinner. She fulfilled the listed duties without trying to change anything drastically. But, she observed how they ate in silence, how they played without making noise, how they always waited for approval before doing anything. She observed the way they looked at the front door at 6 in the evening, waiting for someone who never arrived. She observed how they prepared for sleep with an automated routine of those who had learned no one would come to give a goodnight kiss. Richard crossed paths with Julia only once that first week, one morning as she was coming down the stairs with the uniformed girls to take them to school. He was rushing up, having forgotten some important documents. He stopped, looked at the unfamiliar young woman, vaguely remembered authorizing a new hire, and greeted her with a nod. His daughters froze, as if his presence was such a rare phenomenon they didn't know how to react. He didn't notice their reaction, grabbed the briefcase from his office and left again. The entire encounter lasted less than 30 seconds. After he left, Lucy whispered a question that broke Julia's heart. The little girl asked if she had done something wrong, if that was why her father hadn't spoken to them. Julia knelt and hugged all 3, feeling their small bodies stiffen at first. Unaccustomed to spontaneous physical contact, she said they hadn't done anything wrong, that their father was just very busy. but the lie hurt in her throat. She knew there was busy, and there was absent. Richard Thompson was both. At school, Julia observed the dynamics of the other children, parents picking up and dropping off their kids, lively conversations about the day, farewell and welcome hugs. The triplets watched it all with the expression of someone watching a movie about a reality that didn't belong to them. When Julia picked them up at the end of the day, they came quietly, obediently, without the enthusiastic stories the other children shared. It was on a Friday afternoon that Julia decided to do something different. Instead of taking the girls straight home as usual, she stopped at a simple neighborhood park. The triplets looked confusedly at the swings, seesaws, and slides, as if they were alien artifacts. Julia had to encourage them several times before Claire finally approached a swing. She sat down with excessive care, waiting for instructions. Julia gave her a gentle push, and the swing moved. The girls' eyes widened. A genuine smile, the first Julia had seen since she arrived, lit up her face. In a few minutes, all three were on the swings, laughing loudly for the first time in a long time. Julia pushed them one by one, listening to the peals of laughter that echoed through the park. Other children joined in. An impromptu game of tag started, and the triplets participated, their initial hesitation giving way to an almost frantic joy. It was as if they were reclaiming years of lost childhood in those 40 minutes of simple play. On the way back home, Emily asked if they could come back another time. Julia promised they would and saw in their eyes a cautious hope, as if they didn't want to fully believe but couldn't help it either. When they arrived at the mansion, Mrs. Gable commented that she had never seen the girls so dirty and so happy at the same time. There was dirt on their uniforms, disheveled hair, flushed cheeks. They looked like real children. Julia established her own routine that respected the house's schedule, but included moments of lightness. After homework, 15 minutes of silly dancing in the living room. Before dinner, half an hour of made-up stories where each contributed a part of the narrative. Weekends always included a trip to the park or walks through the mansion's own gardens, exploring corners the girls had never noticed, despite living there their whole lives. Slowly, the triplets began to open up. Claire showed her the drawings hidden under her mattress, hundreds of them, all depicting a family that existed only in her imagination. Julia didn't ask invasive questions, just praised her talent and suggested they frame some to decorate the room. Emily confessed that she sometimes pretended to be sick just to get someone's attention, but always gave up because the housekeeper would just call the private doctor who prescribed medicine without really examining her. Lucy, the most withdrawn, still didn't talk much, but she started to spontaneously seek out Julia's hand when they walked together. One Monday afternoon, while organizing the girls' room, Julia found a shoebox hidden in the back of the closet. Inside were photographs of 5 previous birthdays. They all showed the same scenes: 3 girls in front of elaborate cakes, staff members around them, forced smiles, expensive decorations. There were no parents in the photos. Not a single one. Julia counted the candles in each picture, confirming they were the 5 years of the triplets' lives recorded in cold, empty images, devoid of true affection. When the girls returned from school that day, Julia decided to broach the subject delicately. She prepared a special snack, sat with them at the kitchen table, and asked about birthdays. Emily answered with the brutal practicality that characterized her. She said a birthday was when a big cake arrived. They took pictures and sent them to their parents. Claire added that it was always the same every year. Lucy said nothing, but her eyes filled with tears that she swallowed with a determination impressive for someone so small. Julia asked when their birthday was. Emily replied that it was in 2 weeks and 3 days. She said it was no use getting excited because it would be the same as the other years. The cake would come from the same bakery. They would have to wear the matching dresses their mother had chosen via video call the year before. They would take the same pictures. The description sounded less like a celebration of life and more like a bureaucratic protocol. That night, after putting the girls to bed, Julia lay awake thinking. She came from a family where birthdays were celebrated with simple box mix cake, snacks fried on the spot, relatives squeezed into a small living room singing off-key but with love overflowing from every note. She remembered her own 6th birthday, when her father came home tired from work but brought her a cloth doll made by a neighbor. That crude doll was worth more than all the expensive toys she had seen in the Triplets room. The next day, Julia asked Mrs. Gable for permission to speak briefly with Richard when he arrived. The housekeeper warned that the master rarely arrived before 10 at night and preferred not to be disturbed when he did. Julia insisted it was about the girls. Mrs. Gable promised to let him know when he appeared. It was almost 11 at night when Richard finally walked through the door. He was exhausted from a grueling negotiation, tie loosened, thinking only of a hot shower and bed. Mrs. Gable intercepted him in the hall, informing him that the new nanny needed to speak with him. Richard sighed, considered leaving it for another day, but decided to get it over with to avoid loose ends. Julia was waiting in the living room, her hands trembling slightly with nervousness. She wasn't used to confronting employers, especially powerful men like Richard Thompson, but every time she thought about backing down, she remembered the eyes of the 3 girls waiting at the window, the drawings with absent father figures, the photos of lonely birthdays. She took a deep breath as he entered the room. Richard got straight to the point, asking what had happened if the girls had any health or behavioral problems. Julia quickly denied it, saying the girls were wonderful, polite, intelligent. He relaxed slightly, expecting it to be some simple administrative issue. That's when Julia mentioned the upcoming birthday. Richard nodded, said he already knew, that every year the housekeeper took care of the arrangements. He asked Julia to check with Mrs. Gable, which bakery usually supplied the cakes, and to order the usual one. Julia gathered her courage and said she would like to do something different this year. Richard looked at her with real attention for the first time, noticing the determination in the young woman's eyes. He asked what she had in mind. Julia explained that she wanted to have a more personal, warmer celebration, something the girls would truly feel was special. Richard frowned, not understanding where she was going with this. He paid for the best cakes in the city, the most expensive decorations, professional photos. What could be more special than that? Julia chose her words carefully, saying that sometimes presence was worth more than presents, that attention was worth more than luxury. The phrase hit Richard in a way he didn't expect, an uncomfortable pang of something that could be guilt or defensiveness. He responded, more sharply than he intended, saying he did the best he could, that he worked 16 hours a day precisely to provide the best for his daughters. Julia didn't back down, maintaining a gaze that was firm and gentle at the same time. She said she wasn't judging, just suggesting. Richard considered it for a moment. He was too tired to argue, had important meetings in the coming days, and preferred to delegate and forget. He said Julia was authorized to do whatever she thought best, that she had a budget available for whatever she needed, just to keep everything organized and send the photos as always. Julia thanked him, but before he left she asked one last question. She asked if he would be there on the day. Richard stopped at the door, turned slowly. The question was simple but loaded with implications he wasn't prepared to process at that hour. He said he would check his schedule, that he would try, but it was a complicated time at the company. Julia just nodded, thanked him again, and let him go. She knew try meant no, but at least she had planted the seed. The following days brought a subtle but noticeable change in the house's dynamics. Julia began to involve the triplets in simple decisions that were previously made by others. She asked what clothes they wanted to wear, what snack they preferred, if they wanted to play inside or out. The girls were initially taken aback, not used to having their opinions considered, but they slowly began to express timid preferences that grew in confidence each day. Claire revealed a passion for drawing, but not just random figures. She liked to depict moments, memories, dreams. Julia started sitting next to her during her drawing sessions, asking about the stories behind each image. That's how she discovered how much these children lived in a world of fantasies, where they had present parents, family dinners, outings together. Each drawing was a window into everything that was missing in their lives, surrounded by material abundance. Emily, under the shell of a responsible and controlling girl, hid a child who just wanted permission to make mistakes, to be messy, to not always be right. Julia purposely started making small blunders, dropping pencils, messing up simple recipes, tripping over nothing. It took a few days, but Emily finally relaxed when she realized that Imperfection wasn't punished there. It was just part of being human. The girl laughed for the first time when Julia tried to make a simple cake, and it completely failed, turning into an indefinable brown mush. Lucy remained the most reserved, but Julia had learned to read her silences. The girl had a keen sensitivity to others' emotions, noticing when someone was sad, tired, or pretending. One afternoon, Julia received a call from her father about a late bill they couldn't pay and would need another month. She hung up, worried, trying to hide her distress. Lucy approached silently and held her hand. She said nothing, just stood there, offering comfort in the only way she knew how. The birthday was 10 days away when Julia began to plan in secret. She didn't want a grand event, didn't intend to compete with the expensive parties high society organized. She wanted something authentic, something the girls would remember for the rest of their lives for the right reasons. She started observing what truly made them happy. It was the simple things: baking cookies together and licking the spoon, planting seeds in the garden, and watering them every day, creating crazy stories. Before bed, one Saturday morning, Julia took the three to the kitchen. Mrs. Gable was off, the house was quiet. She announced they would make homemade bread together. The girls looked intrigued at the flour, yeast, warm water, as if they were ingredients in a fascinating science experiment. Julia taught them how to mix, knead, feel the texture of the dough changing under their small hands. They all got covered in flour, laughed when Claire sneezed, and made a white cloud in the air, worked together waiting for the bread to rise. When the smell of fresh bread filled the house, the three were beaming with pride. They cut still warm slices, spread butter that melted instantly, and tasted the result of their own effort. Emily commented it was the best bread she had ever eaten. It wasn't objectively true. It was ordinary bread, a bit uneven, slightly burnt at the edges. But it had been made by them, with their own hands, and that transformed everything. Julia realized something important in that moment. The girls didn't need elaborate parties with professional decorators and expensive caterers. They needed real memories, participation, to feel like they were part of something instead of just spectators in their own lives. The idea for the birthday began to take concrete shape in her mind. That night, after the girls were asleep, Julia called her mother. They talked for almost an hour about cake recipes, about childhood birthdays, about what really mattered in celebrations. Julia's mother, Mrs. Miller, had a simple wisdom born from raising 5 children with little money but a lot of love. She said something Julia wrote down so she wouldn't forget. A child doesn't remember the most expensive gift. They remember who was present. With a week to go before the birthday, Julia tried to approach Richard again. She managed to cross paths with him one morning when he had to come back for forgotten documents. She was preparing the girls' breakfast when he walked into the kitchen, surprised to find someone there at that hour. Julia seized the moment, asking if he had checked his schedule for his daughter's birthday. Richard's mind was elsewhere: an important bid, problems with suppliers, pressure from investors. He answered distractedly that he probably couldn't make it, that he had unmovable commitments, but he would ensure special gifts to compensate. Julia felt her frustration grow but kept her voice calm. She asked if he knew how old his daughters would be. Richard hesitated, did a quick mental calculation and said 6. The hesitation hurt more than if he had gotten it completely wrong. He had to calculate the age of his own daughters. Julia watched the triplets at the next table, quiet as always in their father's presence, hearing everything. She saw the moment Emily looked down at her plate. Claire squeezed her napkin. Lucy briefly closed her eyes. They had heard the hesitation too. Richard noticed the strange silence, looked at his daughters for the first time. That morning, they were impeccable as always, ironed school uniforms, hair tied back, backpacks ready. They looked like 3 small versions of the efficiency he valued in the corporate world. He didn't see the sadness disguised as politeness, the neediness masked as obedience. He said a generic "good morning," grabbed the documents, and hurried out. After he left, none of the girls commented on the episode. They finished their breakfast in silence, grabbed their backpacks, and waited for Julia to take them to school. It was in the car that Emily asked something that shattered Julia's heart into microscopic pieces. The girl asked if it was normal for fathers not to know things about their children. She asked if other kids also had parents too busy to remember them. Julia pulled the car over, turned in her seat, and looked at the three of them. She told the truth, gently. She said no, it wasn't normal for parents not to know their children. She told them about her own family, about how her father worked 3 shifts, but always made it home for dinner, about how her mother worked magic with little money, but was always available to talk. She told them that family wasn't about the number of toys or the size of the house, but about presence, about attention, about love shown in daily gestures. The triplets listened with an almost painful attention, absorbing every word as if it were a fascinating foreign language. Claire asked if their father didn't love them then. Julia quickly denied it, explaining that love could exist but be lost under layers of work, stress, misplaced priorities. She said that sometimes adults forget what really matters, but that didn't mean they didn't love, just that they were confused. At school, Julia observed a scene that deeply marked her. One of the triplets' classmates was crying because she had forgotten her science project at home. The girl's father, a man with glasses and a simple suit, drove back to get it, arrived sweaty and late for work, delivered the project and hugged his daughter, telling her it was okay that accidents happen. The girl stopped crying instantly, hugged her father back, and skipped into her classroom. Lucy watched it all with those large, overly wise eyes. When the father left, she held Julia's hand and asked the only question that mattered. She asked if their father would ever do something like that for them. Julia couldn't answer with certainty, only said she hoped so, that she had faith he would, that sometimes people just needed to wake up. The week passed quickly between school routines and secret planning. Julia talked to the girls about what they would like to do for their birthday, if they could choose anything. Unlike what she expected, none of them asked for big parties, expensive characters, or imported toys. Claire wanted to make a cake, not order one. Emily wanted to decorate their own party with things they made themselves. Lucy, when she finally spoke, said softly that she just wanted Daddy to be there. Lucy's simple request echoed in Julia's head for days. She tried to speak with Richard twice more, but he was always rushing, always late, always had something more urgent. Beatrice called from Europe, asked if everything was all right with the girls, if the birthday was being organized. Julia said yes, tried to mention that presents would be important. Beatrice sighed, said she had a crucial meeting with Swiss investors, that she would send expensive gifts, that she would make it up to them later. Make it up later. Julia was starting to hate that phrase. What later? How much later? After the girls had given up waiting? After the emptiness had taken such deep root that no expensive gift could fill it? She came from a world where later often meant never, because the money didn't exist. But here later meant never, because the will didn't exist. 3 days before the birthday, Julia had an idea. She asked Mrs. Gable for permission to take the girls to her house on Saturday. The housekeeper found it strange, but Julia explained she wanted them to meet, a different kind of family, to see other ways of living. Mrs. Gable, who also had grandchildren neglected by overly busy children, understood the intention and approved. Julia's house in Queens was small, simple, in a noisy, vibrant neighborhood. The triplets got out of the car astonished by the difference. Kids were playing soccer in the street, neighbors chatted on their stoops, music poured from open windows. It was all so different from the controlled silence of the mansion where they lived. Inside the house, the entire family was gathered. Julia's 4 siblings, her parents, 2 uncles, 3 cousins. They all squeezed into a small living room, laughing, talking loudly, interrupting each other. The triplets were shy at first, but Julia's family had a knack for making anyone feel welcome. Within half an hour, Claire was drawing with the cousins, Emily was helping Julia's mother prepare lunch, and Lucy was on Julia's father's lap, listening to stories. They all ate lunch together, plates passed from hand to hand, conversations overlapping, constant laughter. After lunch, they made a simple cornbread cake, everyone participating in the organized mess. The triplets got covered in flour again, licked bowls, fought over the wooden spoon, and it was more valuable than any bakery cake they had ever tasted. When it was ready and came out of the oven, perfuming the whole house, They cut generous, still warm slices and ate at the small kitchen table. On the way back to the mansion, the three were quiet, but it was a different kind of silence than usual. It was the silence of someone processing important discoveries. Emily finally verbalized what they were all thinking. She said Julia's house was small but felt huge because it could fit so many people and so much love. Claire added that she wanted a family like that. Lucy said nothing, just looked out the window with silent tears streaming down her face. Julia realized she had done the right thing, but she had also opened a wound. The girls now knew concretely what they were missing. They had a point of comparison. It was no longer a vague sense of absence, but a painful certainty of deprivation. But Julia believed that seeing was the first step to wanting to change, and she hoped that somehow this experience would echo beyond the girls, reaching the one who really needed to wake up. Monday arrived with the weight of a countdown. Only 2 days left until the triplets' birthday, and the tension in the house was palpable, at least for those paying attention. Julia woke up earlier than usual, mentally preparing her plan for the next few days. She had Richard's generic authorization to do something different. She had the available budget she didn't even plan to fully use, and she had the girls' trust. The only thing missing was the most important and impossible element to guarantee: the presence of their parents. The triplets were quieter than usual during breakfast. Emily pushed food around her plate without eating much. Claire scribbled on her napkin instead of talking, and Lucy just stared out the window. Julia recognized the signs of anticipatory anxiety. They were starting to build their emotional defenses, preparing for another disappointment. It was a protective mechanism that 6-year-old children shouldn't have developed. Julia sat at the table with them and decided to be completely honest. She said she had a special plan for their birthday, something different from all the previous years. She explained that they would make the cake together, decorate the party with things they made themselves, that it would be a real celebration and not just photos to send. The girls listened with cautious interest, wanting to believe but protecting themselves from hope. It was Claire who asked the inevitable question. She asked if their mommy and daddy would be there. Julia took a deep breath before answering, choosing her words like someone walking through a minefield. She said she had spoken with both of them, that they were aware of the date, that she would do everything possible to have at least one of them attend. She didn't promise anything concrete, because she couldn't guarantee it, but she also didn't want to completely extinguish the spark of hope in their eyes. During the drive to school, Julia formulated a bolder plan. She would wait for Richard to arrive on Monday night, no matter the time, and have a frank conversation with him. No more polite suggestions or discreet mentions. A direct conversation about what he was doing to his own daughters, about the legacy he was building or destroying. It was risky. It could cost her her job, but Julia had already decided that some things were worth the risk. The wait was long. Richard arrived, close to midnight, exhausted from a particularly difficult day. Problems with a major project, arguments with partners, pressure from impossible deadlines. He was thinking only of taking a shower and collapsing into bed when he found Julia waiting in the living room, her determined posture signaling that this would not be a quick conversation. He sighed visibly, irritation showing on his face. He asked if it was urgent, if it could wait until tomorrow. Julia stood firm, said it was about the girl's birthday, and yes, it was urgent. Richard gave in more out of exhaustion than genuine interest, sat in an armchair, and gestured for her to begin. Julia started the conversation by asking if he knew what his first memory with his own father was. Richard frowned, not expecting that kind of question. He thought for a moment and remembered being in the construction company's office as a child, watching his father work, feeling important for being there. Julia then asked what his daughter's first memory of him would be. The question hit like a punch. Richard opened his mouth to answer and realized he had no answer. He tried to think of a significant moment, a special memory the girls would have of him. He found only absence. He felt a pang of discomfort but defended himself, arguing that he was building a future for them, that he worked so hard precisely to give them the best. Julia didn't back down. With respect but firmness, she said the girls already had the best in material terms. They had the best school, the best toys, the best house. What they didn't have was a father. She said that for the past 5 birthdays, he had never been present, that the photos he received were empty stagings, that the girls blew out candles alone and had learned not to wait for him. Richard started to get defensive, saying she was overstepping her bounds, that she was just the nanny and had no right to judge him. Julia agreed she had no right to judge, but she had a duty to speak for the children who couldn't speak for themselves. She told him about Lucy asking if she had done something wrong for her father not to look at her. She told him about Claire drawing families that only existed in her imagination. She told him about Emily taking on adult responsibilities because someone had to keep things running. Each story was a stab at the armor Richard had built around his own conscience. He tried to argue that the situation was more complex, that she didn't understand corporate pressures, the responsibilities of commanding a business empire. Julia interrupted him with a simple, devastating question. She asked what was the point of an empire if he lost the princesses. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with inconvenient truths. Richard looked at his own hands, at the expensive watch on his wrist, at the wedding ring he wore more out. Gave habit than meaning. He tried to remember the last time he had really talked to his daughters, known what was happening in their lives, been truly present. He couldn't remember because it had never happened. Julia took advantage of the crack in his defense. In a softer but no less determined voice, she said she was organizing a different kind of celebration for the birthday. Nothing grand, nothing expensive, just something real. She said the girls would make their own cake, decorate with drawings and simple balloons, that it would be their party by them. And then she made the direct request. She asked him to be present, not at the end of the day, not just to appear in photos, but truly present. Richard began to list his obligations for Wednesday, the day of the birthday. A board meeting at 9, a presentation to investors at noon, contract signings at 4, dinner with an important client at 8. Each commitment seemed unmovable. Each had a solid justification. Julia listened to it all and then asked the question that would change everything. She asked which of those meetings he would look back on in 20 years and remember with fondness. The question unsettled something in Richard. He thought of all the meetings over the last 10 years, all the contracts signed, all the successful negotiations. They were a blur in his memory, indistinguishable from one another, important at the time but empty of real meaning now. And then he thought of his daughters growing up without him, having their first memories, forming their personalities, and he was absent from it all. Julia sensed his hesitation and pressed gently. She told him about the visit to her house, about how the girls discovered that family could be different, about the shock of seeing genuine love in action. She said that Claire had asked if it was normal not to have a father who remembered their birthday, and she had to explain that no, it wasn't normal, that they deserved better. Richard felt the weight of the implicit accusation. He asked if Julia was saying he was a bad father. She denied it, said he wasn't a bad father, he simply wasn't a father at all. He was so absent he couldn't even be classified. He was an excellent financial provider, but a non-existent father. And financial providers were replaceable, fathers were not. The conversation went on for nearly 2 hours. Richard tried several times to end it, but Julia persisted. She knew this was probably her only real chance to reach him before it was too late. She told him details he was completely unaware of about his own daughters, that Claire loved to draw and dreamed of being an artist, that Emily was afraid of disappointing people and was therefore too hard on herself, that Lucy understood others' emotions better than most adults but didn't know how to express her own. Each revelation was proof of how distant he was from his daughter's reality. Richard realized with horror that the nanny hired a few weeks ago knew his daughters better than he did after 6 years. The realization was humiliating and painful. He tried to defend himself by saying he had always wanted the best for them, that everything he did was for them. Julia agreed that he probably believed that, but she asked if the girls knew, if they felt it. When Julia finally stood up to leave, she left Richard with one last thought. She said that money could buy a bakery cake, but it couldn't buy the memory of making a cake together. It could buy expensive toys, but it couldn't buy shared playtime. It could buy professional photographers, but it couldn't buy genuine moments worth photographing. and no amount of money could compensate for the lost years, the candles blown out alone, the hugs not given. Richard stayed awake until dawn, unable to sleep. The conversation echoed in his mind, each of Julia's words reverberating with truths he had spent years avoiding. He thought of his own father, who had also been absent, who had built the company but lost his son in the process. Richard had always said he would be different, but he was repeating the exact same pattern. It was a cycle of neglect disguised as ambition. On Tuesday morning, the eve of the birthday, Richard made a decision. He called his secretary and asked her to cancel all his appointments for Wednesday. She reacted with shock, said it was impossible, that he had crucial meetings scheduled for months. Richard repeated firmly to cancel everything, reschedule, do whatever was necessary, but he would not be available on Wednesday. He didn't tell anyone about his decision. He didn't want to create expectations in case he changed his mind or a genuine emergency came up. But for the first time in 6 years, he was putting his daughters first. He felt fear about what it would mean for the business, anxiety about the professional consequences, but he also felt something strange and long forgotten. He felt like he was doing the right thing. Julia noticed something had changed when Richard left the house that morning. He stopped in the kitchen where she was preparing the girls' breakfast, looked at his 3 daughters eating in silence, and just stood there for a moment watching. The girls noticed the unusual presence and tensed up, expecting a reprimand or instruction. But Richard just said good morning differently, less mechanically, more present. After he left, Emily commented that their father had stopped to look at them. It was so rare it was worth mentioning, as if it were an extraordinary event and not something that should be completely normal. Julia felt hope grow in her chest but said nothing, not wanting to promise what she couldn't guarantee. The day passed in quiet preparations. Julia bought simple ingredients for the cake, no expensive bakeries or elaborate orders, flour, eggs, sugar, chocolate, butter. She also bought colorful balloons for the girls to blow up, colored paper for homemade decorations, simple candles. She spent less than $50 of the generous budget Richard had provided because it wasn't about money. At night, after the girls were asleep, Julia organized everything in the backyard. She chose an area near the house but private, with a nice view and enough space. She set up a basic structure that the girls would finish decorating the next day. She wanted it to be collaborative, for them to feel like a creative part of it all. As she worked under the stars, Julia prayed silently that Richard would follow through on what he seemed to have decided that morning. She prayed that Beatrice would have a moment of clarity and come back. She prayed above all that the 3 girls sleeping innocently inside would have at least one birthday they would remember for the right reasons, not as another date of abandonment disguised as a celebration. The sun rose on a clear-skied Wednesday, one of those days when even New York City seemed to breathe better. The triplets woke up early, even before the alarm. Emily was the first to open her eyes, looked at the calendar on the wall and felt her stomach tighten. 6 years old. Another birthday. She tried not to get her hopes up, but it was hard after the talks with Julia, after seeing what was possible in a real family. Claire was already sitting up in bed when her sister turned to look at her. They exchanged a look that needed no words, that silent communication twins develop. Hope mixed with the fear of being disappointed again. Lucy was still lying down, eyes open and fixed on the ceiling, processing emotions with her characteristic depth. The 3 of them knew this day would be important somehow, even if they didn't know exactly how. Julia knocked on the door at 7 sharp, as always, but her energy was different. She entered with a radiant smile, wished them a happy birthday with genuine enthusiasm, and hugged each of them. The girls responded shyly, unaccustomed to such effusive displays of affection. Julia announced they had a special day ahead, and it would start with a different kind of breakfast. In the kitchen, she had prepared star-shaped pancakes, freshly squeezed orange juice, and fruit cut into smiling faces on their plates. It was simple but made with love, every detail thought out for them. The triplets sat at the table and, for the first time on a birthday, started their day feeling truly special, not just remembered out of obligation. During breakfast, Julia explained the plan. They wouldn't go to school that day. She had already excused their absence. They would spend the morning making the cake together, the afternoon decorating the yard and getting everything ready. and in the late afternoon they would have their celebration. Claire asked who was coming, if there would be guests. Julia replied it would be just them, intimate, special. She didn't mention Richard, not wanting to create expectations in case he didn't show. Richard woke up that morning with a strange feeling in his chest, anxiety mixed with something he couldn't initially identify. He got up, got ready as usual, but instead of leaving at 5 in the morning, he waited. It was 6:30 when he finally came downstairs, the time when the girls usually had breakfast. He walked into the kitchen and the scene he found caught him off guard. His 3 daughters were laughing around Julia, their faces animated in a way he had never seen. They had chocolate at the corners of their mouths from the pancakes, hair still messy from sleep, casual clothes instead of their school uniforms. They looked like normal, happy, alive children. When they saw him standing in the doorway, the laughter ceased instantly. They returned to the polite, tense posture that was their default in his presence. Richard felt it like a stab. His own daughters were afraid of him, or worse, had learned they needed to behave differently when he was around. He cleared his throat, wished them a happy birthday in a voice that came out hoarser than he intended. The 3 responded with a whispered, formal, "Thank you, Daddy." Julia watched it all with a heavy heart, hoping he wouldn't give up at this first hurdle. Then Richard did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He sat down at the table with them. He didn't take out his phone, didn't open his laptop, just sat and asked if he could have breakfast there. Julia quickly prepared a plate for him, served hot coffee. The girls watched as if witnessing a supernatural phenomenon. Their father was having breakfast with them on a Wednesday, on their birthday. The initial silence was uncomfortable. No one quite knew what to say, how to bridge years of distance in a single meal. It was Lucy, surprisingly, who spoke first. She asked if her father liked pancakes. The question was simple but loaded with meaning. She was trying to get to know him, discover his preferences, establish a connection. Richard swallowed the lump in his throat and replied that yes, he loved pancakes, especially star-shaped ones. The answer opened a small breach. Claire asked what his favorite color was. Richard had to think, realizing he wasn't even sure himself. He said blue just to say something. Emily commented that hers was yellow because it was the color of happiness. Richard looked at his 6-year-old daughter talking about colors of happiness and realized she knew more about emotions and life than he had learned in 42 years. After breakfast, Richard said he needed to make a few calls, but would be right back. He locked himself in his office and began the series of cancellations he had planned. Every partner he called protested. Every client was dissatisfied. Every rescheduled commitment created complications. But Richard stood firm. For the first time in his professional life, he was putting something above the company. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time. Meanwhile, Julia gathered the girls in the kitchen. The wide marble countertop was covered with ingredients: flour, sugar, cocoa powder, eggs, butter, baking powder. Everything was measured and organized, but waiting for small hands to bring it to life. The triplets looked at it all with renewed fascination, remembering the experience at Julia's house, eager to repeat it. Julia explained each step before they began. They would make a simple chocolate cake, nothing sophisticated, but all made by them. Each would have a specific task, but they would work together. Emily would be responsible for the dry ingredients, Claire for the wet, Lucy for the mixing. It was teamwork, collaboration, something their lives rarely required. Emily began measuring the flour with excessive concentration, wanting to get it perfect. She spilled a little on the counter and froze, expecting a reprimand. Julia just laughed and said a kitchen without a mess was a kitchen without a soul. The girl relaxed slightly, allowing herself imperfection. Claire broke the eggs with exaggerated care, marveling at the slippery texture of the whites. Lucy observed everything before starting to mix, understanding the process before executing it. When they started mixing everything, the mess was inevitable and glorious. Flour flew through the air when Claire sneezed, creating a white cloud that made them laugh hysterically. Cocoa powder stained everyone's clothes, including Julia's. The batter stuck to their fingers, to the spoons, to everything. And it was perfect. It was real. It was memory being created in every moment. Richard finished his calls and returned to the kitchen, drawn by the sound of laughter. He stopped at the door, watching unnoticed. The four of them were covered in flour and chocolate. The kitchen looked like it had been hit by a culinary hurricane, and he had never seen his daughters so completely happy. Julia noticed his presence and smiled, gesturing for him to come in. The girls tensed up again when they realized their father was there. Richard felt the shift in the air, the way joy turned to caution. He decided he needed to break that pattern somehow. He approached the counter and did something completely out of character. He dipped his finger in the batter and tasted it, declaring, "It was delicious." The girls looked at him as if he had performed magic. Julia, reading the room perfectly, suggested they needed someone to grease the pan with butter. She offered the job to Richard. He accepted, rolled up the sleeves of his expensive shirt, and began the simple task. He was beside his daughters, participating present. Claire watched her father's large hands next to her small ones and felt something she couldn't name, but that was akin to belonging. When the batter was ready, they poured it into the pan together. Richard held the bowl while Emily scraped it with a spatula, making sure every drop was used. They put it in the oven ceremoniously, set the timer, and all stood there waiting, as if they were awaiting a miracle instead of just a cake baking. While the cake baked, Julia proposed they make the frosting. Richard confessed he had never made chocolate frosting in his life. Claire, with newfound boldness, offered to teach him. The role reversal was strange, but beautiful. The 6-year-old girl explaining to the executive father how to melt chocolate and mix it with heavy cream. Richard followed the instructions with an attention he never gave to corporate presentations. The smell of baking chocolate filled the entire house. Mrs. Gable appeared in the kitchen, drawn by the aroma and the unusual scene. She found her employer with his sleeves rolled up, flour on his face, laughing with his daughters. The housekeeper had to blink several times to make sure she wasn't hallucinating. In all her years working there, she had never seen Richard Thompson in the kitchen, let alone cooking. When the timer finally went off, it was Lucy who had the honor of opening the oven. The cake was beautiful, a little uneven, rising, more on one side than the other, but fragrant and golden. They took it out carefully, set it to cool, and all four stood there looking at it as if it were the most important thing in the world. And in that moment, it was. While they waited for the cake to cool before frosting it, they sat around the messy countertop. Richard looked at his 3 daughters, really looked for the first time in a long time. He saw Emily with flour on her nose, serious even when she smiled, carrying invisible responsibilities. He saw Claire with chocolate on, her cheeks dreamy and creative eyes, an artist in the making. He saw Lucy quiet but attentive, processing everything with a depth that was startling for her age, and he realized he didn't know these people. They were his daughters biologically, they carried his surname, lived in his house, but they were essentially strangers to him. They had distinct personalities, their own dreams, specific fears, and he knew none of it. He had lost 6 complete years of discovering who they were, of participating in their formation, of being present for the small things that build a life. Richard felt his eyes burn with tears he hadn't shed in years. Julia noticed and discreetly created a distraction, asking the girls to choose how they would decorate the cake. They got excited discussing possibilities, giving Richard time to compose himself. He briefly left the kitchen, washed his face in the bathroom, looked at himself in the mirror, and made a silent promise. He would never be the absent father again, no matter what it cost professionally. When he returned, the cake was cool and ready for frosting. They worked together, pouring the melted chocolate, spreading it with spatulas, creating imperfect but beautiful swirls. It didn't look like an expensive bakery cake. It was 100 times better. It was a cake made with love, with joined hands, with shared laughter. It was a concrete memory taking edible form. They finished around noon. The kitchen was a chaos of dirty dishes, scattered ingredients, a floor in desperate need of cleaning, and no one cared. Richard looked around and realized that this mess was more valuable than any perfectly organized board meeting. It was life happening, real and raw and beautiful. Julia suggested they have a light lunch and then prepare the decorations for the yard. The girls went to shower and change, still chattering excitedly about the cake. Richard stayed in the kitchen helping to clean up, a task he had never done in his life. Julia worked beside him in silence for a few minutes before speaking. She thanked him for coming, for staying, for participating. Richard shook his head, said he was the one who should be thanking her. He thanked her for having the courage to confront him, to make him see what he was missing. He said he had woken up that morning afraid it was too late, that his daughters wouldn't want him there anymore. Julia held his arm and said something he would carry forever. She said it's never too late to start being present, that children forgive quickly when they see genuine effort. The rest of the day unfolded like a dream. They decorated the yard together, blowing up balloons until they were dizzy, hanging up drawings the girls had made, setting up a simple but beautiful table. Richard discovered he was terrible at making paper decorations, that he was afraid of balloons popping, that his daughters were infinitely more creative than he was. And he discovered that it was okay not to be perfect, that the value was in the trying. The yard was transformed into something magical under the soft afternoon light. Colorful balloons swayed in the gentle breeze. The girls' drawings hung like banners. The table was set with a simple cloth but covered in the artistic creations of the three. In the center, the lopsided, imperfect homemade cake was the most beautiful thing Richard had ever seen. Not for its appearance, but for what it represented. Hours together, hands joined, memories created. The triplets wore dresses they had chosen themselves, not the matching ones imposed by their mother. Emily chose yellow, her color of happiness. Claire wanted pink with stars. Lucy asked for sky blue. They were different from one another for the first time, three individuals with their own tastes instead of an identical set. Richard realized he had never really seen each of them as a separate person. He always saw them as a single block of daughters. Julia brought special candles she had bought at a small neighborhood shop. They weren't expensive or elaborate, but there were 6 star-shaped candles, one for each year of their lives. She placed them carefully on the cake, spaced so that each girl could blow out 2. Claire commented that they were the most beautiful candles she had ever seen, and Julia knew it wasn't about objective beauty, but about the fact that they had been chosen with specific care for them. Richard looked at his watch. It was 4 in the afternoon. Normally at this time, he would be in his 3rd meeting of the day, dealing with spreadsheets and projections, discussing profit margins. At that moment, he was in a yard decorated with children's drawings, waiting to sing Happy Birthday to daughters he barely knew but desperately wanted to know. The difference between where he was supposed to be and where he chose to be had never been so stark. Julia signaled for them to gather around the table. Richard stood on one side, she on the other, the 3 girls between them. She lit the candles one by one, the small flames dancing in the light wind. The triplets watched the candles with a heart-wrenching seriousness, as if they were seeing something sacred. And in a way, they were. It was the first time in 6 years they would have a father present for that moment. Julia started singing Happy Birthday, and her voice was soon joined by the girls. Richard hesitated at first, his voice caught in his throat with emotion, but then he forced himself to sing. His deep voice mixed with his daughter's high-pitched ones and Julia's sweet one, creating an imperfect but sincere harmony. Lucy looked at her father singing, and tears began to stream silently down her face. When they got to the Happy Birthday, dear Ma part, Richard realized he didn't know which name to sing. They had individual names, but he had always called them collectively the girls when referring to them. It was Julia who led, singing the 3 names in sequence: Emily, Claire, Lucy. 3 distinct people, 3 separate lives that deserved to be individually recognized. The silence that followed the song was thick with expectation. The girls looked at the lit candles but didn't blow them out. Richard realized they were waiting for something, a signal or permission. Then he understood. They were waiting for him to say something, to acknowledge the moment in some way. He cleared his throat, tried to find the right words, and realized there were no right words for 6 years of absence. So he simply told the truth. He said he was there for the first time, that he should have been there for the previous 5 years, that he had no good enough excuse for his absence. He said they deserved so much more than a father who needed to be reminded of their birthday, that they deserved someone who not only knew the date, but looked forward to it. His voice broke at the end, choked with raw emotion. Emily, always the responsible one, always the one trying to keep everything under control, was the first to break. She began to cry, not the silent, contained crying she had learned to do, but a deep sob of years of accumulated hurt. She said they waited every year, that they stood at the window waiting for him to come home, that they made drawings to show him but he was never there to see them. Claire joined her sisters crying, the words tumbling out between sobs. She said she thought she had done something wrong. That was why Daddy didn't want to be with them, that she tried to be quieter, more polite, more everything she thought he wanted. But it was never enough because he always preferred to be anywhere but with them. Lucy said nothing, but her tears spoke volumes. She just looked at her father with those large eyes that saw too much, that understood too much, carrying a sadness no child should know. Her silence was more devastating than any words could be, because it was resignation. It was acceptance of something unacceptable. Richard felt as if the ground had opened up beneath his feet. Every word from his daughters was a stab to his conscience. Every tear was concrete evidence of the damage he had caused. He had tried to convince himself for years that it was fine, that providing financially was enough, that eventually he would have time for them. But time never came, and his daughters grew up without him, wounded by a neglect he chose not to see. He fell to his knees on the lawn, not caring about the expensive suit he was wrinkling, not caring about the corporate dignity he was losing. None of that mattered in the face of the pain he had caused his own daughters. He opened his arms in a desperate gesture and begged for forgiveness. He said he was wrong, that he had been selfish, that he had chosen the wrong priorities. He said he didn't deserve forgiveness, but was begging for a chance. The triplets hesitated, years of distance creating an invisible but real barrier. Emily took the first step, followed by Claire and finally Lucy. They approached slowly, testing if this moment was real or another disappointment. When Richard wrapped his arms around them, their small bodies stiffened at first, unaccustomed to that kind of contact with their father. But then something broke. Emily clutched his shirt tightly, Claire hid her face in his shoulder, and Lucy finally sobbed out loud, releasing years of pent-up emotion. And Richard cried as he hadn't cried since childhood, a deep, cleansing cry of a man who finally saw what he had almost permanently lost. Julia moved away discreetly, giving them privacy for a moment that belonged only to them. She wiped her own tears silently, feeling the weight of the responsibility she carried. If she hadn't confronted Richard, if she had just done her job by the book, these children would have had another lost birthday, another year of accumulated wounds. But now, watching father and daughters together for the first time for real, she knew she had made the right choice. He didn't know how long they stayed like that, kneeling on the lawn among balloons and children's decorations, just holding each other. The sun was beginning to set on the horizon when they finally separated, faces streaked with tears, but something fundamental having changed. Richard looked at each daughter individually, truly saw each one for the first time. He looked at Emily and saw a 6-year-old girl carrying the weight of an adult, trying to keep everything running because someone had to. He saw her need for control as a symptom of a world that always seemed on the verge of collapsing. He silently promised that she wouldn't have to be responsible for everything anymore, that she could be a child. He looked at Claire and saw a suppressed artist, a dreamer who had learned to keep her dreams to herself because no one was interested. He saw her drawings as attempts to create a better reality on paper, since she couldn't have it in life. He promised he would give her space to create, to dream, to express everything she kept inside. He looked at Lucy and saw an old soul in a small body, someone who understood emotions deeply, but didn't know how to name or process her own. He saw her silence not as shyness, but as protection, a way to not expose even more vulnerability. He promised to learn her language, to validate her silences as much as her sister's words. Julia returned gently, asking if they were ready to continue the celebration. The girls wiped their faces, smiled through the remnants of tears. There was a lightness in the air that hadn't been there before, as if a necessary storm had passed and left everything cleaner, clearer, more real. They sang Happy Birthday again, this time with firmer, happier voices. The triplets blew out the candles together, making their silent wishes. Richard wondered what they had wished for. Maybe in previous years they had wished for their parents' presence, to be noticed, to be loved in the way they needed. He hoped that today, for the first time, they had wished for other things, normal things that children wish for when they already have the essentials. They cut the cake ceremoniously, each making the first cut together. The cake was a little dry, the frosting had run unevenly. It wasn't technically perfect, but it was the best cake any of them had ever tasted because it had been made together, because every bite carried the memory of laughter in the kitchen, of flour flying, of hands working in unison. They ate without rushing, talking about small things and big things. Richard asked questions he should have asked years ago. What was their favorite toy? What did they like to do at school? Did they have friends? What did they dream of being when they grew up? Each answer was a revelation. Each shared story was a brick building a bridge that should have always existed. Claire talked about wanting to be a painter, about imagining giant canvases in galleries. Richard listened with real attention, not the divided attention he gave in meetings. He promised they would visit museums together, that she would have all the art supplies she wanted, not expensive gifts to compensate for absence, but tools to support genuine dreams. Emily confessed she was afraid of disappointing everyone, that she tried to be perfect because she thought that way her parents would notice her. Richard felt his heart break once more. He said she didn't need to be perfect, that he loved her exactly as she was, with flaws and imperfections and all. He saw in the girl's eyes that she didn't completely believe him, but she was willing to try. Lucy finally spoke more than usual. She said she liked to observe people, to understand feelings, that one day she wanted to help sad people. Richard realized his 6-year-old daughter had more emotional intelligence than he had accumulated in decades. He promised he would learn from her, that he would let her teach him about the important things he had forgotten or never known. The sun set completely, and Julia turned on garden lights that created a magical atmosphere. They stayed there, talking, laughing, sometimes crying, but truly together. Richard lost track of time, something that never happened. He was always timing meetings, calculating minutes, optimizing seconds. But there, with his daughters, time ceased to be an enemy and became an ally. It was almost 10 at night when the girls started to yawn, the emotionally exhausting day taking its toll. Julia suggested they get ready for bed. The triplets hesitated, afraid that when they left the moment would end, that they would return to the reality where their father was absent. Richard sensed their fear and did something he had never done. He said he would put them to bed himself. They went up together, a small procession climbing the marble stairs that suddenly seemed less imposing and more welcoming. Richard entered the girls' room for the first time since it had been decorated years ago. He really saw the space, the shelves of untouched toys, the hidden drawings, the perfectly made beds. It was a room that looked like a showroom, not a place where children actually lived. He helped each one get ready, a completely new experience. He didn't know where the pajamas were, whose toothbrush was whose, which side of the bed each preferred. He had to ask everything, and each question was an admission of how distant he had been. But he was trying, and the girls recognized the effort. When they were finally tucked in, each in her own bed, Richard sat in the middle of the room, not quite sure what to do. Julia appeared at the door, gave a discreet nod, and left, leaving the moment to them. Claire asked if he could tell a story. Richard realized he didn't know any children's stories, that he had never done that. So he started to invent one, creating a story about 3 stars who felt dim until they discovered that together they shone brighter than anything in the sky. It was clumsy, without the fluency of a professional storyteller. But it was his, created in that moment for those specific girls. They listened, enchanted, not because it was the best story, but because it was their father telling it. When he finished, he did something he never imagined doing. He said goodnight to each one individually, a kiss on the forehead, a tight hug. Emily held his face with her small hands and asked a question that summed up 6 years of absence. She asked if he would be back tomorrow, if this day had been real, or a dream that would end when the sun rose. Richard held her hands and made a promise he knew would change everything. He promised he was there to stay, that he had learned the most important lesson of his life, that he would never, again put the company above his daughters. He saw the cautious hope in her eyes, the fear of believing mixed with a desperate desire for it to be true. He repeated the promise to each of them, swearing that this was not an isolated special day, but the beginning of all their days being different. Richard descended the stairs after putting the girls to sleep, each step heavier than the last. The day's emotional adrenaline was beginning to dissipate, leaving in its place a sharp awareness of everything that needed to change. He found Julia in the kitchen finishing up, the last traces of the celebration. She cleaned the dishes with careful movements, preserving even the cake crumbs as if they were sacred relics. He sat at the table, head in his hands, and Julia realized the man before her was deeply shaken. She offered him coffee, which he accepted gratefully, more for the need to hold something than for the drink itself. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the weight of the day hanging between them like a physical presence. Richard broke the silence first, his voice hoarse with emotion. He said he had seen his own daughters for the first time, truly, that he had discovered 3 incredible people he barely knew. He confessed that for years he had convinced himself he was doing everything right, that providing financially was love enough. But today he had realized he had built an empire of empty things, while his daughters grew up starved for attention. Julia listened without interrupting, letting him verbally process what he had discovered. When Richard asked where to begin fixing 6 years of absence, she answered with the simple wisdom that characterized everything she did. She said that to begin was simply to continue, doing what he had done today: show up, be present, participate. It didn't require grand gestures or dramatic changes, it required daily consistency. Richard mentioned the meetings he had cancelled, the contracts he had postponed, the partners who were dissatisfied. Julia asked if he regretted his choices that day. He vehemently denied it, saying it was the most important day of his life, that he would trade 1,000 contracts for a day like that. She then pointed out that this was his answer. If one day was worth 1,000 contracts, imagine a lifetime of such days. But Richard had practical concerns. The company needed him. He had responsibilities to shareholders and employees. He couldn't just abandon everything. Julia agreed it wasn't about abandoning, but rebalancing. She asked if the company would survive if he worked 8 hours instead of 16. Richard admitted it probably would. That much of the extra time was more about control and ego than real necessity. They talked late into the night about concrete changes he could implement, hiring a reliable COO to manage the day-to-day while he took on a more strategic role, establishing fixed hours, arriving at 9 and leaving at 5, prioritizing family dinners, work-free weekends, real vacations. Each suggestion seemed impossible at first, but the more they talked, the more Richard realized they were choices, not impossibilities. The biggest obstacle would be Beatrice. Richard knew he needed to have a serious conversation with his wife, a conversation he had been putting off for years. Their marriage had been empty for a long time, maintained by convenience and inertia. They were partners in a project of appearances, not partners on a life journey. And the biggest victims of this charade were the 3 girls who deserved present parents, whether together or apart. Julia asked when Beatrice would be back. Richard checked her messages, always brief and factual. She would return at the end of the following week, another 10 days of absence. He decided they would have the conversation as soon as she returned, not by text or phone, but in person. If he was going to change everything, he would change it for real, with no half measures or convenient postponements. That night, Richard barely slept. His mind replayed the day over and over, each moment etched in vivid detail. The sound of his daughter's laughter in the kitchen, the feeling of cake batter sticking to his fingers, the weight of their small bodies when they finally hugged him, Emily's tears releasing years of hurt, Lucy's question about whether he would be back tomorrow. Each memory was precious and painful, a reminder of what he had almost permanently lost. The next morning, Thursday, Richard woke up at 7 instead of his usual 5. He dressed carefully, choosing more casual clothes than his usual suit. He went downstairs and, for the second time in his life, had breakfast with his daughters. Their surprise was evident, mixed with a cautious hope that yesterday had not been an exception, but the start of a new pattern. Emily was the first to test the permanence of the change. She asked if Daddy could take them to school today. Richard looked at Julia, who nodded encouragingly. He had never taken his daughters to school. He wouldn't even know the way. But he said yes, he would love to. He saw their little faces light up in a way that was worth more than any closed deal. In the car, on the way to school, Richard observed the dynamic between the three. Claire pointed out things through the window, creating stories about each building, each person on the street. Emily corrected facts when her sister exaggerated, but with a kindness that showed love beneath the practicality. Lucy watched everything in silence, occasionally squeezing her father's hand as he drove. At the school entrance, Richard experienced something completely new. Other parents dropping off their children, quick chats, farewell hugs, promises to pick them up later. It was a world that had always existed parallel to his, but in which he had never participated. The triplets hesitated before getting out, as if testing whether it was permissible to hug. Him there, in front of everyone. Richard opened his arms and they ran, hugging him quickly before going inside. As he drove back, he passed the company building on Park Avenue. He looked at the mirrored windows, imagining everyone inside already working for hours, meetings happening, decisions being made. He felt a pang of anxiety about what he might be missing, what important discussions were happening without him. But then he thought of his daughters, walking into school with real smiles, of Lucy's question about whether he would be back, and the anxiety dissolved. He arrived at the office around 9:30. His secretary looked surprised, unaccustomed to seeing him arrive so late and so casually dressed. Richard asked her to call an urgent meeting with the main partners for that afternoon. He had important decisions to announce and knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. He spent the morning reviewing the company's structure, identifying exactly where his presence was essential versus where it was just habit or ego. He discovered that easily 80% of what he did could be delegated to competent executives he already had, but didn't fully trust. Not because of their lack of ability, but because of his own neurotic need to control everything. The afternoon meeting was tense. Richard announced that he was restructuring his role in the company. He would hire a COO, limit his working hours, and prioritize his personal life. The partners reacted with shock and concern. One of them questioned if he was having some kind of crisis, if he needed professional help. Richard almost laughed at the irony. He was finally getting out of a crisis, not entering one. He explained with brutal honesty that he had spent 6 years neglecting his daughters in the name of the company, that he had missed birthdays, important milestones, entire years of their development, that he had woken up yesterday to the fact that he was building professional success on personal ruins, and that he would not do it anymore. The company was important, but it wasn't everything. It wasn't even the most important thing. The partners tried to argue about responsibilities, commitments, market expectations. Richard listened to it all and held his ground. He said that if the company couldn't survive with him working human hours, then it had serious structural problems. That a healthy business did not depend on one person completely sacrificing their personal life, that he was willing to sell his stake if necessary, but he would not go back on his decision. The threat of selling scared the partners enough for them to back down. They reluctantly agreed to support the restructuring as long as it was done gradually. Richard accepted the reasonable compromise. Over the next few weeks, he would implement progressive changes, but starting immediately. And by leaving today at 5 in the afternoon to pick up his daughters from school, when he left the office at 5 on the dot, he felt the surprised stares of employees. Richard Thompson leaving early was so unusual, it became a topic of conversation. But he didn't care. He drove to the school, arrived 15 minutes before dismissal, and waited along with other parents. Some recognized him, the famous executive now doing something as mundane as picking up his kids. When the triplets came out and saw him waiting, their reaction was instantaneous. They ran to him with an enthusiasm they didn't try to hide. Claire jumped into his arms. Emily held his hand tightly and Lucy rested her head on his shoulder. One of the teachers. She observed the scene with interest. She had never seen the triplets' father there before. In the car on the way home, the girls chatted excitedly about their day. Richard asked questions, genuinely interested in their answers. He found out that Claire was struggling with math, that Emily was the best reader in the class, that Lucy loved art time. Each discovery was a piece of the puzzle he should have been assembling years ago. At home, for the first time, he participated in the afternoon routine. He helped with homework, discovering that explaining fractions to a 6-year-old was more challenging than negotiating with investors. He sat on the floor and played with dolls, taking on ridiculous roles in made-up stories, and didn't care about his lost dignity. He had dinner with them at the large table that was finally serving its purpose, talking about everything and nothing. At night, he put them to bed again, this time with more confidence, already knowing where things were, whose toothbrush was whose. He told another made-up story, better than yesterday's, about 3 princesses who saved their kingdom not with magic but with kindness. The girls listened, enthralled, asking for details, asking questions, actively, participating in the narrative. When he came downstairs after they were asleep, he found Julia in the kitchen again. She smiled as she saw him. She commented that he was doing well, that the girls were visibly happier. Richard thanked her once more, said she had saved his family. Julia gently corrected him, saying he had saved his own family by choosing to change. Richard asked how long Julia planned to stay. She explained that nannies usually moved on when they were no longer needed. He asked her to stay not as a nanny now that he would be more present, but as part of the family, as an educator, as the person who had made a real difference. Julia said she would think about it, but that she would stay at least until everything stabilized. That night, alone in his empty bedroom, Richard thought about Beatrice, about the marriage that had slowly died of mutual neglect, about the conversations that had stopped happening, the intimacy that had vanished, the shared dreams that had turned into parallel lives. He knew the conversation they needed to have would change everything legally, but honestly, everything had already changed years ago. All that was left was to make it official. But mostly he thought of the 3 girls sleeping in the room next door, of how he had almost lost them without even realizing it, of how neglect didn't have to be intentional to be devastating, of how he had woken up at the last possible moment before the damage was irreparable, and he silently promised that every day from then on would be proof that the change was real, consistent, and permanent. The following days established a new rhythm in the Thompson house. Richard would wake at 7, have breakfast with his daughters, and take them to school. He worked from 9 to 5 with an intense focus he discovered was more productive than his previous 16-hour days of fragmented attention. He would pick up the girls, participate in their afternoon, have family dinner and put them to bed. It was a simple routine that most fathers considered normal, but for him, it was revolutionary. Emily was the first to test if the change was permanent or temporary. On the 3rd day, she asked if Daddy would still be there tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. Richard realized she needed constant confirmation, reassurance that she wouldn't wake up one day to find everything had gone back to the way it was. He knelt at her level and promised he would be there every day, that this was the new reality, not a passing vacation. Claire began to share the drawings she had kept hidden. Every afternoon after school, she would show her father her creations of the day. Richard learned to really look, to ask questions about color choices, about the stories behind the images. He discovered his daughter had genuine talent, not just a vague promise, but real skill that should be nurtured. He hired a private art tutor, not to force early professionalization, but to support an authentic passion. Lucy took longer to trust completely. She observed everything with those wise eyes, testing for consistency before investing emotionally. But slowly she began to seek out her father's lap spontaneously, to hold his hand uninvited, to whisper thoughts she had previously kept to herself. Richard learned that with her, silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was a form of communication he needed to learn to read. Julia observed the transformation with quiet satisfaction. She didn't interfere unless necessary, letting the father and daughters discover their own dynamic. But she was always available when Richard needed guidance, when the girls needed mediation, when the house needed balance. Her presence was the invisible glue holding everything together as the new structure solidified. At the end of the first week, Richard received a call from Beatrice. She casually informed him she would be back on Sunday night and asked if everything was okay with the girls. Richard confirmed that yes, it was more than okay. He hesitated, then said they needed to talk when she arrived. Beatrice caught his serious tone, asked if it was about the daughters. He replied that it was about everything, about them, about choices they needed to make. Beatrice didn't seem surprised. There was a long pause before she replied that she also thought they needed to talk. They agreed to discuss it in person without the girls around. Richard hung up with a strange feeling, a mix of relief and apprehension. The marriage had been dead for years, but making it official always carried weight, especially thinking about the impact on his daughters. That weekend, Richard did something he had never done before. He took the Triplets on an outing, just them. Julia had a well-deserved day off, and he took full responsibility. They went to Central Park, a place he had driven past 1,000 times but never truly visited. The girls ran on the great lawn, fed ducks at the pond, and rode rented bicycles with training wheels. Richard discovered a physical exhaustion he had never experienced in marathon meetings. Chasing after 3 6-year-old girls was more tiring than any negotiation, but it was a good, satisfying exhaustion with real purpose. When they stopped for a snack at a simple kiosk, he realized he was happier eating a hot dog in the park with his daughters than he had ever been at business dinners in Michelin-starred restaurants. Claire made an observation that stuck with him. She said it was the best day of her life, not because they did anything extraordinary, but because Daddy was really there. Richard understood deeply. It wasn't about expensive places or elaborate activities. It was about presence, attention, genuine participation. It was the simple things that built precious memories. On Sunday, while the girls played in the yard, Richard mentally prepared for his conversation with Beatrice. He rehearsed what he would say, how he would approach the delicate subject. But he knew that no matter how much he planned, it would be difficult. Ending a marriage always was, even when both parties knew it was necessary, even when the love had long since died. Beatrice arrived close to 10 at night, executive suitcase in hand, professional posture intact. She greeted Richard formally, asked about the girls who were already asleep. He offered her tea, and they sat in the living room they rarely used, a space too formal for intimacy, but appropriate for the conversation they were about to have. Beatrice surprisingly began. She said she had also been thinking a lot during her trip, that she had built an impressive international career but at the cost of everything personal, that while in London, she realized she would go weeks without thinking about her daughters, without missing them, and that had scared her, the coldness with which she treated her own motherhood. Richard listened, recognizing in her the same dawning awareness he had experienced, but where he had decided to change completely, she had come to a different conclusion. Beatrice confessed she had never wanted to be a mother. From the start, that she had gotten pregnant due to social pressure, family expectations, the concept that it was the next logical step. But motherhood had never fit her, and she had tried to force something that didn't exist naturally. The brutal honesty hurt, but Richard appreciated it. He said he had also failed miserably as a father, but had woken up in time to fix it. He told her about the birthday, about Julia forcing him to see reality, about the transformation of the last few days. Beatrice listened with an expression that mixed relief and sadness. Relief because he had taken on what she couldn't, sadness because it confirmed they were ill-suited for each other. They talked for hours with a frankness they had never had during their marriage. Beatrice admitted she loved her career more than anything else, that her trips were not an obligation but an escape. Richard admitted he used work as an excuse to avoid facing his personal emptiness. They were ruthlessly honest about their mutual failings, about a marriage that was a partnership of convenience, about daughters who deserved better. When the discussion turned to what to do, they both already knew the answer. Separation was inevitable, necessary, healthy, but the structure needed to protect the girls. Richard proposed that he would have primary custody since he was restructuring his life to be present. Beatrice agreed with a speed that might seem cold but was honest. She would visit when she could, maintain contact, but she wouldn't pretend to be a present mother when she couldn't be one. The proposal might sound negligent, but Richard understood. Forced presence was worse than honest absence. It was better for Beatrice to visit occasionally with quality than to be there physically but emotionally absent. The girls had already learned the difference between being present and just existing in the same space. They settled the practical details with the coldness of executives closing a deal. The division of assets would be smooth. Both had their own resources. A generous child support payment that Beatrice insisted on paying, acknowledging her lack of contribution in time. Beatrice would keep an apartment in New York for visits, but would live primarily in London, where she had better professional offers. The conversation about how to tell the girls was more difficult. Richard wanted honesty appropriate for their age. To explain that, Mommy and Daddy wouldn't live together anymore, but they both loved the girls. Beatrice suggested he tell them alone that she was already absent enough that the change wouldn't be dramatic. Richard disagreed, saying they needed to do it together, to give their daughters a chance to ask questions to both of them. The next morning, Monday, Richard didn't go to work. He informed his office he had an urgent family matter. He and Beatrice waited for the girls to wake up, have breakfast, and then ask to talk. The triplets sensed the seriousness in the air and became tense. Emily asked if she had done something wrong. The question broke Richard's heart again, the way his daughters assumed blame for adult problems. Richard explained with simple but honest words. He said that he and Mommy still liked each other as people, but they weren't happy living together. That sometimes adults decide to live separately, and it wasn't anyone's fault, especially not the daughters. That he would stay in the house with them, that their routine wouldn't change, but Mommy would live somewhere else and visit when she could. Claire started to cry, not out of surprise, but confirmation. She already knew their family was different, broken in ways her drawings couldn't fix. Emily was quiet, processing, likely having concluded this long ago with her premature logic. Lucy looked at her mother with those eyes that saw too much, and Beatrice had to look away, unable to face the silent judgment. Beatrice tried to explain that she loved her daughters, but couldn't be the mother they deserved, that she thought it was better to be honest than to pretend. The girls listened with an impressive and sad maturity. Emily asked if she could call Mommy whenever she wanted. Beatrice assured her she could. That physical distance didn't mean complete abandonment, but they all knew it did. Beatrice was already absent. The separation just made the existing reality official. The triplets weren't losing a present mother, just confirming they didn't have one. The difference was that now they had a father who was trying to compensate, to be present for two. After Beatrice left to arrange her move, Richard stayed with the girls. They were quiet, processing in their own ways. He didn't try to force conversations or fake cheerfulness. He just remained available, present, letting them come to him when they needed to. It was Lucy who finally broke the silence. She asked if Daddy was going to leave someday too. Richard pulled her onto his lap and made the most important promise of his life. He said he would always be there, that he had discovered too late what really mattered, but now he knew. That she and her sisters were his absolute priority, that he would choose them 1,000 times over anything else. Claire wanted to know if it was their fault Mommy didn't want to stay. Richard patiently explained that adults make choices based on who they are, not on their children. That Mommy had her own difficulties, issues that had nothing to do with how wonderful they were, that some people just can't be present parents, and it hurt. But it wasn't the children's fault. Emily, ever practical, asked what the new routine would be. Richard explained that little would change in reality since he was taking over primary care. Julia would continue to help, he would be present every day, and Mommy would visit periodically. Emily nodded, satisfied with the clear structure. She needed order, predictability, and Richard understood that as a defense mechanism against emotional chaos. That night he put the three to bed with extra care. He read 2 stories instead of 1, left the hallway light on as they had never asked before, but he knew they needed. He stayed in their room until all 3 were completely asleep, watching their small faces relax in sleep. When he went downstairs, he found Julia waiting. She had heard everything, sensed the weight of the day. She prepared a strong tea, which he gratefully accepted. She asked how he was. Richard answered honestly, sad about the failed marriage, guilty for the lost years, but determined to do differently from now on. Julia said that was all he could do, that the past couldn't be changed, but the future was malleable. Richard asked about Julia's own family, if she wasn't neglecting them by staying there so much. She explained her siblings were older. Her father was recovering well and she sent money regularly. She visited on weekends when she had time off. But she liked being there, making a real difference in the lives of girls who needed it so much. He offered her a generous raise, better benefits. Julia thanked him but said it wasn't about the money. It was about purpose, about seeing the transformation she had helped catalyze. But she would accept resources to help her family, to pay for better treatment for her father, to ensure her siblings' education. Richard insisted on doubling her salary and setting up an educational fund for her siblings. It was the least he could do for the woman who had saved his family. The following weeks brought constant adjustments and discoveries. Richard learned daily about being a present father, making mistakes but correcting them quickly. He discovered that Emily needed structure and predictability, so they created a visual calendar with clearly marked routines. Claire needed creative time without pressure, so they established a sacred art hour every afternoon. Lucy responded best to one-on-one conversations, so he dedicated individual time with each of them before bed. The most visible transformation was in the girls. Emily began to relax her obsessive control over everything. She allowed herself to have a messy room, to leave toys scattered, to make mistakes without panicking. Richard realized her rigidity was a response to the emotional chaos she felt, an attempt to control what she could since she couldn't control her. Parents' presence. With a father finally present and consistent, she could be a child. Claire flourished creatively. She filled the house with drawings, paintings, clay sculptures. Richard turned a living room wall into a rotating gallery of her works, framing each creation as if it were a Picasso. The girl beamed with validation, with seeing her art valued not for being cute, but for being a genuine expression of herself. She began to create thematic series, visual stories that revealed a rich imagination. Lucy took longer to open up completely, but when she did, it was a profound transformation. She began to verbalize observations she had previously kept to herself, sharing insights about others' emotions. Richard discovered his 6-year-old daughter understood emotional nuances he had ignored his whole life. She noticed when he was stressed even when he pretended to be calm, when her sisters were upset but said they were fine, when Julia was worried about her family. At work, Richard implemented the promised changes. He hired a competent COO, delegated daily operations, and took on a more strategic role. He discovered that the company not only survived his reduced hours, but thrived. Executives motivated by real autonomy made better decisions than when they waited for his approval on everything. Productivity paradoxically increased when he stopped micromanaging. The partners who had initially resisted began to see the benefits. Richard, in strategic meetings, was focused, creative, and energized in ways he never was when chronically exhausted. His ideas improved, his decisions were more thoughtful, his long-term vision was clearer. He was bringing a better version of himself professionally, precisely because he no longer lived only for work. Beatrice visited 3 times in the first 2 months. The visits were brief, cordial, but emotionally distant. She brought expensive gifts that the girls politely thanked her for but quickly set aside. They preferred drawing with Daddy to playing with imported toys from Mommy. The difference was clear. Presence did not replace presence. On the 3rd visit, Beatrice spoke privately with Richard. She said she was thinking of accepting a permanent position in London, that her trips would become more spaced out. Richard wasn't surprised. She was following her nature, being honest about her limitations. They agreed she would visit 4 times a year, maintain weekly video contact, and would always be welcome. It was an unconventional but honest arrangement. The girls processed, their mothers' growing absence each in their own way. Emily created a schedule of visits, marking on the calendar when Mommy would come. Claire drew a series about her confused feelings toward her mother, art as therapy. Lucy simply accepted it with that old wisdom of hers, understanding that some people couldn't give what they didn't have. Richard decided they needed professional support. He hired a child psychologist who began weekly sessions with the 3, not because something was wrong, but because they needed to process the changes in a healthy way. The professional praised the girls' emotional openness, their ability to verbalize complex feelings. She credited it to Richard and Julia's presence, creating a safe environment for vulnerability. One afternoon, 3 months after the transformative birthday, Richard had an important meeting with international investors. He could have cancelled it to stay with the girls, but it was genuinely necessary. He explained to his daughters the night before, apologized for not being able to pick them up that day. He expected disappointment, fear that he was reverting to old patterns. But Emily surprised him. She said it was okay that they knew Daddy had important work sometimes, that the difference wasn't him never working but him always coming back, that they trusted him now because he had consistently proven he would choose them when it really mattered. The maturity of her speech, the implicit forgiveness, the rebuilt trust, it all hit Richard deeply. The meeting was a success, but Richard realized something fundamental. In the past, he would have celebrated a professional victory for days, reliving the triumph. Now he just wanted to finish and go home. Professional success was satisfying but not fulfilling. The void he had tried to fill with work for decades was only truly filled by genuine, human connections. When he arrived home that night, at 8 instead of the usual 5, the girls ran to hug him, not with the desperation of someone fearing abandonment, but with the joy of someone who knew a temporary absence was just that, temporary. They told him about their day, asked about his, and then they had dinner together normally. It was a beautiful, healthy, real routine. That night, Claire gave him a drawing she had made. It showed 4 people holding hands, but this time they were all colorfully filled in. Julia was included, a consistent and important figure. And, for the first time, the father's space was complete. Not empty or hastily scribbled, but carefully colored and detailed. Richard kept that drawing as his most precious treasure. The following weekend, Richard had an idea. He proposed a short trip, just him and the girls, the first time doing something like that. Julia would have a long, well-deserved break to visit her own family. He rented a simple house on the coast, nothing ostentatious, just a cozy space near the sea. The triplets were excited in a way they never were for the elaborate international trips Beatrice used to plan but never execute. At the beach, Richard discovered the simple joy of building sandcastles, picking up shells, and running from the waves. Claire collected shells, creating elaborately decorated sand sculptures. Emily organized a wave-jumping championship, establishing complex rules that everyone followed seriously. Lucy spent hours just watching the sea, fascinated by its vastness. At night, they made dinner together in the small kitchen of the rental house. Nothing sophisticated. Pasta with simple tomato sauce, salad, fruit for dessert. They ate at the worn wooden table, talking about everything and nothing. Richard realized this was the best dinner he had ever had. Incomparably. Better than all the Michelin-starred restaurants he had frequented. Before bed, the 3 asked to sleep together in the largest room. Richard arranged mattresses on the floor, indoor camping style. He lay in the middle, a girl on each side and the third at his feet, and they talked in the dark. Emily asked if they could do this every year. Richard promised they would, that it would be a new tradition. Simple trips together, without unnecessary luxury, just shared time. Lucy, almost asleep, whispered something Richard almost didn't hear. She said that this year she had received the most important gift for her birthday. Not the cake, not the celebration, but her daddy back. That all the previous birthdays had been missing something essential, and it was finally complete. Richard felt tears stream silently, grateful he had woken up in time. On the way back to New York, they stopped at a roadside diner, a simple place with plastic tables and a basic menu. The girls ate sandwiches with the appetite of those who had played all day at the beach. Richard watched the 3, hair still sandy, clothes wrinkled, mouths smudged with ketchup, and thought it was the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. An executive in a suit recognized Richard and approached to greet him. He commented with surprise on seeing him there, such a simple place for someone of his caliber. Richard replied that he was with the most important things he had, and simple didn't mean inferior. The executive looked at the 3 noisy girls, clearly not understanding. Richard didn't care. He didn't need them to understand. Back to the routine, Richard maintained a careful balance between work and family. Some weeks were more challenging, genuine emergencies arose, but he had learned to differentiate. Between urgent and important, a real emergency from manufactured drama. And when he had to choose, he consistently chose his daughters. Business could wait, childhood could not. Julia observed the transformation with deep satisfaction. She saw the man she had known as an absent father become a dedicated present one. She saw girls who were polite but empty become complete children with healthy emotions. Her work there was essentially done, but she stayed because she had become family. One night, Richard and Julia talked about her future. He asked about her long-term plans, if she intended to continue as a nanny. Julia confessed she had always dreamed of studying education, of working with children professionally, but her family needed her income. Richard proposed a full scholarship, her salary maintained while she studied, and a guaranteed position upon graduation if she wanted it. Julia was moved by his generosity, but Richard insisted it wasn't charity. It was an investment in someone who had changed everything for his family, who deserved to have her own dreams supported. Moreover, he wanted his daughters to see the example of an educated, fulfilled woman who also came from a humble background. Julia was a living inspiration that circumstances did not define destiny. The triplets celebrated when Julia told them about college. Claire offered to make a celebration poster. Emily asked how she could help with her studies. Lucy just hugged Julia for a long time, communicating in silence how much she mattered. To the girls, Julia was much more than a nanny. She was chosen family. Months after that transformative birthday, the Thompson house was emotionally unrecognizable. Physically, it was the same luxurious mansion, but the energy was completely different. There was laughter echoing through the halls, drawings on the walls, the organized mess of a life truly lived. It was no longer an impeccable showroom, but a real home, with all the beautiful imperfections that implied. Richard looked back and barely recognized the man he had been. The obsessed executive who measured success in closed contracts and hours worked. Now he measured success in his daughter's smiles, in spontaneous hugs, in meaningful conversations. His financial net worth was the same, but his emotional net worth had grown exponentially. He knew the journey wasn't complete, that building a solid relationship with his daughters was a lifelong job. But the foundation was now established, a strong bedrock of consistent presence, demonstrated love and clear priorities. And for the first time in a long time, Richard Thompson slept peacefully, knowing he was living a life that mattered. The first year after that transformative birthday passed quickly, filled with small moments that built a big life. Richard had established traditions the girls already considered sacred: breakfast together every day, family dinner without electronics, Saturdays of simple adventures, lazy Sundays at home. It was a comforting structure that allowed for flexibility within a consistent pattern. Emily, now 7, had become more relaxed but maintained a natural organization that was part of her. The difference was that she no longer used control as a defense mechanism, but as a genuine skill. She helped Richard organize routines, but also allowed herself to be spontaneous when moments called for it. The balance between structure and flexibility was healthy now, no longer a rigidity born of fear. Claire had developed an impressive art portfolio. She took classes with the private tutor Richard had hired, but her creativity came from within. Her works began to attract attention at school, and the principal suggested a year-end exhibition. Claire was nervous about the idea, but Richard encouraged her, saying the world deserved to see her talent. It was the validation she needed, not from a father trying to compensate for absence, but from a genuinely proud father. Lucy remained the most introspective, but had learned to express the deep thoughts she once kept to herself. She revealed an interest in helping people, in understanding emotions. The psychologist who saw the girls commented that Lucy had a rare empathetic ability, a gift for reading others' feelings. Richard considered that precious, not something to be suppressed for being different, but to be nurtured as a unique talent. Julia had started college, studying education at night. During the day, she continued to be with the girls, but now she also studied, setting an example of educational dedication. The triplets saw her doing homework alongside them, studying for exams, and learned that education was a lifelong journey. Richard was proud to have facilitated that, to see his investment in her yield visible growth. At work, Richard had consolidated his new position. He was the strategic chairman, not the operational CEO. He participated in big decisions but didn't manage daily minutiae. The company thrived, and he was more professionally satisfied than ever because work had a healthy proportion in his life. It wasn't everything. It was an important part, but not the only one. One afternoon, Richard received an invitation to speak at a business conference on work-life balance. He initially hesitated, not considering himself an expert. But then he realized he had a valuable story, not of easy success, but of hard-won redemption. He accepted the invitation, deciding to be vulnerable about his failings before presenting his learnings. He prepared the presentation with the unlikely help of his daughters. Claire made illustrations showing the difference between the absent father he was and the present father he had become. Emily organized a timeline of the changes. Lucy wrote, with his help, about how she felt before versus now. It was a personal, raw, honest presentation in a way that corporate keynotes rarely are. On the day of the conference, Richard took the stage in front of hundreds of executives. He began by showing an old photo of his daughters blowing out candles alone, photos from 5 lost birthdays. An uncomfortable silence fell over the auditorium. Then he told the full story, without embellishing his failures. He spoke of the humble Nanny, who confronted him, of the breaking point in the garden, of the decision to radically change. He showed current photos, completely different, girls laughing genuinely, not forced smiles. Him present in real moments, not justified absence. He talked about how his productivity had improved when he reduced his hours, how his decisions became wiser when he had a life outside of work. He presented concrete data showing the company had grown more after he stopped working obsessively. But the most impactful part was his daughter's words. Richard read Lucy's statement aloud. "Before, my daddy lived here, but he wasn't here. Now he's really here. I can touch him and he sees me." The brutal simplicity of the observation echoed through the auditorium. Several executives discreetly wiped their eyes, recognizing their own failings in the words of a 7-year-old girl. He ended with a plea. "I lost 6 years of my daughters' lives chasing professional success. But a success that cost real human connections wasn't success. It was an expensive illusion. I woke up in time to fix it, but imagine how much I lost permanently. Don't wait until you've almost lost everything to realize what really matters." The speech received a standing ovation, but more importantly, it generated conversations. Dozens of executives approached Richard afterward, sharing their own struggles, asking for advice. He realized his story resonated because many were living similar versions. Neglect disguised as ambition was an epidemic in the corporate world, and few had the courage to name it. One particularly emotional CEO confessed that his teenage son barely recognized him anymore, that their relationship was destroyed. He asked if it was too late. Richard answered honestly, it was never too late to start, but the longer you waited, the harder it got. He encouraged him to try to be present, even if his son resisted at first. Consistency eventually broke down walls. Weeks later, Richard received emails from executives implementing changes. One had reduced his travel by 70%. Another had hired a COO to take over the day-to-day. A third had started having dinner with his kids every day, no matter what. Each email brought gratitude, and Richard realized his vulnerability was creating waves of change. By exposing his own failings, he gave others permission to acknowledge theirs. The triplets turned 7 that year. The birthday was a completely different celebration from all previous ones. Richard took the entire day off, not arriving at 5 but absent from the morning. They made a cake together again, an established tradition. They decorated the yard with Julia's help. They invited school friends for the first time. The party was loud, chaotic, beautiful. Children running, shouts of joy, the organized mess typical of a real children's birthday. Richard participated actively, not as a supervising adult, but as someone genuinely having fun. He played silly games, let himself be blindfolded for pin the tail on the donkey, ate too much cake and laughed out loud. At the moment of singing, "Happy birthday," Emily asked for silence to speak. With a maturity impressive for a 7-year-old, she thanked her daddy for being there, not just today but every day. She said the best gift they got last birthday was him back, and every day since had confirmed it wasn't temporary. Richard fought back tears, aware of everyone watching, but he didn't care. Claire presented a special gift she had made. It was a picture book telling their story. Before, when they were sad in a luxurious house, and after, when they became happy with a present father. Each page was a miniature work of art, and Richard realized his daughter had processed everything through her art. It was beautiful and painful simultaneously, a visual record of a family's transformation. Lucy didn't give a material gift, but wrote a letter. With Julia's help for the more complex words, she expressed feelings she usually kept inside. The letter said, "Daddy, thank you for seeing me now. Thank you for asking what I think. Thank you for staying when it gets hard. You're the best dad in the world, not because you're perfect, but because you try every day." Richard read it aloud, his voice breaking, and hugged the three of them without caring about the audience of children watching. After the party, when the guests had gone home and the girls were asleep, exhausted and happy, Richard sat with Julia in the garden. They looked at the messy decorations, the cake remnants, the evidence of a true celebration. Julia commented that the difference a year made was surreal. Richard agreed, still processing the journey he had taken. Julia mentioned that a professor at her university had given a lecture on modern parental neglect. He spoke of parents who were physically present but emotionally absent, about how money couldn't replace time. She had immediately thought of the Thompson family's transformation, of how rare it was for someone to truly change. Richard was the exception, not the rule, but he proved that change was possible. Richard asked what made him the exception. Why did he change when so many others didn't? Julia considered carefully before answering. She said he was lucky to wake up before he lost everything permanently, but he also had the humility to accept confrontation. Many executives, when confronted, became defensive. He chose to listen, even when it hurt. That initial choice made all the difference. They talked about the future. Julia would graduate in 3.5 years and was considering a master's degree afterward. Richard offered to pay for it, but she wanted to build something of her own as well. They agreed he would help, but she would maintain her autonomy. For Julia, it was important not to become dependent, even on a family she loved as her own. Regarding the girls, they discussed how to prepare them for life. Richard worried about raising spoiled, overly privileged daughters. Julia suggested involving them in social work, exposing them to different realities. Not poverty tourism, but real engagement. Richard liked the idea, already thinking about how to implement it appropriately. Months later, they began volunteering at an institution Julia knew, a place that helped children from underprivileged communities. The Triplets went once a month, played with other children, helped with activities. Emily organized games, Claire taught art, and Lucy was simply present in a way that made other children feel seen. The experience was transformative for everyone. Richard saw his daughters understanding their privilege, developing empathy and gratitude. They saw that not every child had a present father, a safe, home-guaranteed food. Not as an abstract lesson, but through real friendships. They learned that the luck of birth was not a merit, but a responsibility to help those with less luck. A girl from the institution, named Leah, became particularly close to the Triplets. She was 8, had recently lost her mother, and lived with a grandmother who could barely support them both. Claire drew with her, Emily helped with her homework, Lucy listened to her sorrows. Richard observed a genuine connection forming. One day, Leah casually mentioned she had never eaten at a restaurant. The Triplets were shocked, the concept incomprehensible to them. Richard saw a teaching opportunity. On their next volunteer day, he asked Leah's grandmother if he could take her to lunch with them. The woman, proud but practical, accepted after Julia diplomatically mediated. They took Leah and the Triplets to a simple diner, nothing fancy. Leah was dazzled, even though it was a common place. She ordered a hamburger and ate it slowly, savoring every bite. The Triplets watched their friend react to something they considered normal, and the realization clicked. Privilege was real, concrete, not abstract. On the way back, Emily asked why some children had less than others. Richard explained social complexities in an age-appropriate way, about inequality, the lottery of birth, imperfect systems. He said they couldn't fix everything, but they could make a difference for specific people. Small acts of kindness, multiplied, were how change happened. That night, the three asked to have a serious talk. They proposed using their allowance to help Leah. Richard was proud of their initiative, but explained their allowance was theirs. He would help Leah separately, and they could contribute in other ways. He suggested they continue being her friend, including her when possible, offering the emotional support money couldn't buy. Claire had a better idea. She proposed an art exhibition of her own, selling her drawings, with the proceeds going to the institution. Richard loved the initiative and helped her organize it. The school agreed to host the event, and Claire worked for months preparing pieces. They weren't the works of a 7-year-old, but of a young artist with real talent and purpose. The exhibition was a surprising success. Parents, teachers, and even people from the community showed up. Claire sold everything, raising a significant amount. But more important than the money was the lesson learned. She had a gift she could use for a greater good. Talent wasn't just for personal satisfaction, but a tool for positive impact. 3 years had passed since that transformative birthday. The triplets were now 9, growing into confident girls with well-developed, distinct personalities. The Thompson house was completely different, not because of the physical structure that remained luxurious, but because of the energy that filled it. It was a true home, with constant laughter, meaningful conversations, and love demonstrated daily. Emily excelled academically, but no longer with the anxious rigidity of before. She genuinely loved learning, especially math and science. Richard discovered his daughter had a brilliant analytical mind, capable of solving complex problems with impressive ease. He was considering a specialized school for gifted children, but wanted to ensure it would be her choice, not his imposition. One afternoon, they had a serious talk about her academic future. Emily confessed she sometimes felt pressure to be perfect, even though no one was demanding it anymore. Richard recognized the old pattern resurfacing, but now they had tools to deal with it. He explained that intelligence was a gift, not an obligation, that she could use it as she wished, without guilt for not maximizing her potential every second. Emily then revealed something surprising. She said she wanted to be a teacher when she grew up, specifically for children in underprivileged communities like the institution they visited. Not for the salary, obviously, but for the impact. Richard felt a deep emotion hearing that. His daughter, raised in a mansion, with every privilege, choosing a path of service. It was proof that the values he taught were taking root. Claire had become a small, well-known artist in local circles. Her initial exhibition had generated other opportunities. Small galleries began to show her work, always with a percentage of sales going to charity. She had developed a unique style, mixing childlike innocence with surprising emotional depth. Critics commented on the timeless quality of her art. But success hadn't gone to Claire's head. She remained humble, always remembering that art was about expressing truths, not about fame. Richard ensured his daughter wasn't exploited, that success didn't steal her childhood. Art was a joy, not a job. When it stopped being fun, they would stop, regardless of the money involved. Once Claire received a substantial offer for a series of paintings about her family. The buyer specifically wanted the images she had made depicting their transformation. She hesitated, saying those were too personal. Richard fully supported her decision, explaining that not everything had a price. Some things were too precious to sell, and it was okay to keep them for herself. Lucy remained the most introspective, but had found her voice through writing. She had started a diary at 7, and now, at 9, wrote surprisingly deep short stories. Her psychologist commented that Lucy processed emotions through words, creating narratives that helped her understand a complex world. Richard read her writings when she shared them, always impressed by her insights. Lucy had expressed an interest in psychology, in understanding why people felt what they felt. The psychologist who saw the family suggested Lucy participate in a children's support group she facilitated, not as a patient but as an observer. With appropriate permission, Lucy began to watch the sessions, learning about structured empathy and active listening. The three maintained a close connection with Leah, their friend from the institution. She visited frequently, and Richard had learned to navigate the delicate dynamic. He didn't want Leah to feel like a charity project, but genuinely part of their lives. He treated her as he would any of his daughter's friends, with respect and care. Leah flourished with the attention, becoming more confident and hopeful about her future. Richard had discreetly established an educational fund for Leah, ensuring she could study without financial worries, not as a grand, announced gesture, but as quiet support that would allow for future choices. Leah's grandmother found out and tried to refuse, but Richard explained it was an investment, not charity. Leah had immense potential, and it would be a waste not to support her. Julia had graduated with honors. In education, her decision on a master's degree postponed while she worked at a public school in an underprivileged community. She continued to live with the Thompson family, no longer as a nanny, but as a family member. The Triplets called her Aunt Julia, and their relationship transcended any professional definition. It was chosen family, bonds of love, not blood. Richard often reflected on their journey, from a completely absent father to a dedicated present one, from a man defined by his work to a multidimensional person. The transformation had been neither easy nor quick. There had been relapses, moments, when the temptation to return to old patterns was strong. But his commitment to change, supported by the structures he had created, kept him on the path. The company continued to prosper under the COO's management. Richard remained involved strategically, but not operationally. He discovered that distance allowed for a clearer vision, wiser decisions, and paradoxically, the company was worth more now that he worked less. Quality trumped quantity. It always had. It just took him decades to learn that. Beatrice visited 4 times a year as agreed, but the interactions remained cordial and distant. She sent expensive gifts, called occasionally, but a real emotional connection never developed. The Triplets accepted this reality, no longer expecting their mother to change. They had a present father, Aunt Julia, paternal grandparents Richard had reconnected with after years of distance, and a solid support network. On one of her visits, Beatrice commented privately to Richard that he had done an incredible job with the girls, that they were well-adjusted, happy and balanced, despite growing up without a present mother. Richard thanked her but corrected her, saying they had a present mother in Julia, even if not biologically. Motherhood was about action, not just biology. Beatrice agreed without resentment, honestly acknowledging her own limitations. Richard began giving regular talks on work-life balance, personal transformation, and intentional fatherhood. He had become a respected voice on the subject, not for theoretical expertise but for raw, lived experience. He spoke openly about his failings, about the lost years, about the pain of almost losing everything, but also about redemption, about how it's never too late to change, about the power of consistent daily choices. The talks generated tangible change. Executives implemented flexible work policies in their companies. Fathers started mandatory family dinners. Mothers reduced unnecessary corporate travel. Every email of gratitude he received confirmed that his vulnerability created permission for others to change too. It was an unexpected but valuable legacy. At one particularly memorable talk, Richard invited the Triplets to participate. At 9, they had the maturity and articulation to contribute. Emily spoke about the importance of consistency, how her father's daily presence had built trust. Claire showed a series of drawings illustrating the before and after. Lucy read an essay about what it meant to have a father who truly saw her. The impact was devastating in the best sense. An audience of tough executives cried openly, listening to 9-year-old children articulate brutal truths about parental neglect. It wasn't judgment, it was testimony. And testimony had a power that theory never could. Many executives approached Richard afterward, saying their own children were the same age as the Triplets, and they realized they were making the same mistakes. One CEO asked directly, how late was too late? If his children were already teenagers or adults, was it impossible to recover? Richard answered honestly that the more time passed, the harder it became, but impossible was never the case. Humans had an incredible capacity to forgive when they saw genuine effort. He encouraged him to try, to be vulnerable about his failings, to ask for forgiveness without expecting to be forgiven immediately. Months later, the same CEO sent an email thanking him. He had told his 16-year-old son he had failed as a father, asked for forgiveness and explained he wanted to change. The son had reacted with initial skepticism, but the CEO maintained consistency. Dinners together, playing video games, even if he didn't understand them, genuine interest in his son's life. Slowly, the relationship began to rebuild. It wasn't perfect, there was permanent damage, but it was better than resignation. Richard had learned that redemption didn't mean erasing the past, but building a different future in spite of it. The scars remained, evidence of lost time. But scars were also proof of healing, of wounds that had closed, even if imperfectly. And each present day was a brick in the construction of a new legacy, gradually replacing the imprints of previous absence. The triplets, for their part, developed remarkable resilience. Not in spite of their initial difficulties, but partly because of them. They had a deep empathy for other children suffering from neglect. They recognized signs that many adults missed. The girl who was too quiet at school, the boy who would do anything for attention, children who seemed to carry an invisible weight. And they intervened in their own way, offering friendship, including them in games, being the presence they themselves had needed. Richard was immensely proud of that empathy. It wasn't privileged naivety, but wisdom gained through experience. His daughters knew the pain of feeling invisible to their own parents, and they used that knowledge to ensure other children didn't feel that way around them. It was the transformation of trauma into purpose, a precious emotional alchemy. One quiet evening, all of them sitting in the living room after dinner, Lucy asked a profound question. She asked if Richard regretted being absent for the first 6 years. He thought carefully before answering, wanting to be honest but appropriate. He said he deeply regretted the lost time, that he would give anything to go back and do it differently from the beginning. But he also said the experience taught him lessons he might not have learned otherwise, that the pain of almost losing something precious was an effective teacher, that he didn't glorify their suffering, or his. But he recognized that their imperfect journey had brought them to where they were, and that every day since that transformative birthday, he actively chose to be present, not out of habit, but because of the vivid memory of the alternative. Claire commented that she liked an imperfect father who was trying more than a perfect father who never made mistakes. Richard asked why. She explained that a perfect father would be intimidating, impossible to relate to. But a father who made big mistakes and worked hard to fix them was inspiring. It showed that people could change, that mistakes weren't final, that constant effort mattered more than perfection. That night, after putting the girls to bed, Richard stayed in their room for a few extra minutes. He watched the three sleeping peacefully, their faces relaxed, feeling safe. He thought about how he had almost squandered this, how he had come dangerously close to losing everything by chasing the wrong definition of success. But he also thought of Julia, the humble nanny who had the courage to confront him. If she hadn't risked her job to speak uncomfortable truths, where would they be now? Probably exactly where they were before. Girls growing up neglected amid luxury, him working obsessively until an inevitable collapse, a family existing only on paper. He went downstairs and found Julia studying, preparing lessons for her students. Richard sat down, waited for her to finish before speaking. He thanked her once more for saving his family. Julia smiled, tired but genuine. She said he had saved his own family by choosing to change. She had only held up a mirror, but he had walked through the door. 5 years had passed since that birthday that changed everything. The triplets were now 11, on the cusp of adolescence, but with a solid emotional foundation that many adults never build. The family transformation that began on that June day continued to deepen, not as a single event, but as a renewed daily commitment. Emily was at the gifted school she had chosen, but she maintained a strong bond with the community institution. Every week, she volunteered to teach math to younger children, discovering a vocation for education she had suspected for years. She was only 11, but she already knew for certain she wanted to be a teacher, specifically in public schools where she could make the biggest difference. Richard fully supported her, even knowing his daughter could earn fortunes in other careers. He had learned a fundamental lesson. Success wasn't about accumulated money, but about the positive impact generated. And Emily would have an immense impact as an educator, shaping the lives of children who desperately needed teachers who truly cared. Claire was at a specialized arts school, nurturing a talent that was flourishing exponentially. Her works were now sold regularly, with profits always divided between herself and causes she chose to support. She had developed a keen social consciousness, using her art as a tool for change. Her latest series focused on neglected children, powerful portraits that forced viewers to confront an uncomfortable reality. The series generated controversy and conversation, exactly as Claire intended. Some criticized it as exploitation, others praised it as activism. She stood firm in her purpose, explaining that art should be unsettling. It should provoke reflection, not just decorate walls. Richard was immensely proud of her courage, of the way she used her privilege and talent to amplify silenced voices. Lucy was writing her first book, a collection of short stories about children facing difficult situations. The stories were fiction, but based on real observations from the support group she participated in. She had a gift for capturing complex emotions in accessible language, making readers feel what her characters felt. A small but respected publisher was interested in publishing it when she finished. Richard still sometimes marveled at who his daughters had become, 3 unique individuals, each with specific gifts and clear passions. But more important than their talents, they were kind, empathetic, conscious people. They used their privileges to lift others, not to separate themselves. They were everything he hadn't consciously taught them, but what they had learned by observing his change. Julia had completed her master's degree in special education, specializing in children from underprivileged communities. She worked as a pedagogical coordinator at the institution where they had started volunteering years ago, transforming lives daily. She continued to live with the Thompson family, their relationship having evolved into something indefinable but precious. She wasn't an employee, not blood family, but she was essential. Richard often reflected on their entire journey, from an obsessive businessman who measured value in closed contracts to a man who understood that real wealth was measured in deep relationships. The transformation had been neither instantaneous nor easy. There were 5 years of conscious daily choices, of constant refusals to return to old patterns, of consistently prioritizing people over profits. The company prospered under the structure he had established. The COO was competent, the board functioned autonomously, and Richard supervised strategically without micromanaging. He worked 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, a schedule many would consider part-time, but which he had discovered was completely sufficient. The quality of work mattered infinitely more than the quantity of hours. Financially, he was richer than ever, ironically precisely because he stopped obsessively chasing wealth. But wealth mattered less. It was a tool, not a goal. He used his resources to help others, to create opportunities, to make a tangible difference. The fund he had established was helping dozens of children like Leah, ensuring their education, regardless of economic circumstances. Leah, by the way, was now 13 and flourishing. She was studying at a private school on a scholarship Richard had provided, but she maintained a strong connection to her community of origin. She and the Triplets remained close, a genuine friendship that transcended socioeconomic differences. Leah visited frequently, and when she was there, she was treated exactly like any of their other friends. Richard had become an informal mentor to several business people seeking to rebalance their lives. He didn't charge for consulting. He saw it as a personal mission to help others avoid his mistakes. The conversations usually began with executives asking for productivity advice, but quickly deepened to the real issues: fear of irrelevance if they didn't work obsessively, guilt over neglecting their families, the feeling of being trapped in a golden cage. He was honest about the difficulties, about how much it had cost him to change, but also about the rewards, about how life was infinitely richer now. Not everyone changed. Many listened but returned to old patterns, but some truly transformed, and those became part of a growing network of people living intentionally, prioritizing human connections over professional achievements. On one special afternoon, Richard organized a surprise for the girls. It was the 5th anniversary of that transformative birthday, and he wanted to mark the occasion, not with an elaborate party, but with something meaningful. He gathered the 3 of them in the garden where it all began, the same space where they had cried and reconnected 5 years ago. There he read letters he had written to each of them, letters reflecting on their journey together, on the transformation each had facilitated just by existing, by forgiving, by giving him repeated chances. To Emily, he thanked her for her patience while he was learning, for forgiving his initial inconsistencies, for believing that change was possible. To Claire, he thanked her for the art that forced him to feel, for the brutal honesty in her images, for never letting him forget where they came from. To Lucy, he thanked her for the emotional depth that had taught him to see beyond the superficial, for the silences that spoke volumes, for the difficult questions that forced real reflection. And to all 3 together, he asked for forgiveness again for the first 6 years, even knowing he had already been forgiven. He said he would always carry those years as a reminder of what mattered, of what he would never lose again. The triplets cried, not from sadness, but from a complex emotion that came from processing the entire journey. Emily said she wouldn't trade their story for any other, that the imperfection and recovery were part of who they were. Claire said their transformation inspired her art, that she would never run out of material as long as they remembered where they started and how far they had come. Lucy, always the most profound, said something that stuck. She said that sometimes the best stories are about redemption, not perfection, that a perfect father from the beginning would be less interesting than a father who made mistakes but corrected them, that she would tell their story someday, not as a tragedy, but as a testament that change is possible when someone finally decides to really see. In that moment, in the same garden, where 5 years ago he had cried on the lawn begging for forgiveness, Richard realized something fundamental. He was no longer the same man. He hadn't just changed his behaviors, he had transformed his essence. His values were different, his priorities were different, his definition of success was fundamentally different. He was a new version of himself, consciously built on the ruins of who he had been. And the girls were no longer the sad, neglected children from 5 years ago. They were confident preteens with a strong sense of purpose, deep empathy, and impressive resilience. They still carried the emotional scars of their first 6 years. They probably always would. But the scars didn't define them. They were incorporated into larger narratives of recovery and growth. Julia joined them in the garden, completing the circle. Richard thanked her once more, never tiring of expressing his gratitude. He said she had saved 4 people in that house, 3 girls and a lost father. Julia gently corrected him as she always did. She said she had only held up a mirror, forcing him to see an honest reflection. But he had walked through the door, he had done the hard work of real change. As the sun set over the garden, they sat there talking about the future. Emily talked about the university she wanted to attend, the teacher training program she had researched. Claire mentioned an art school in another state, an opportunity that excited but also scared her. Lucy confessed a fear of growing up, of eventually leaving the house that finally felt like home. Richard assured them that growing up and leaving were natural, even desirable. But no matter how far they went geographically, they would always be connected. That he had learned the most important lesson possible. Presence wasn't about physical proximity, but about consistent attention, genuine interest, and demonstrated love. That he could be present in their lives from any distance, because presence was a choice, not a circumstance. That night, as they did every anniversary since that first transformative one, they made a cake together. It was a sacred tradition now, a symbol of everything they had rebuilt. The cake was always lopsided, always imperfect, always delicious, not for its taste but for its meaning. It represented collaboration, participation, memories created together. They sang "Happy Birthday," not to anyone specifically, but to themselves as a unit, celebrating 5 years of transformation, 5 years of consistent choices, 5 years of building something real on the rubble of previous neglect. It was a strange celebration, perhaps, but perfectly theirs. Afterward, sitting at the table with slices of cake, Richard made a final observation. He said that in the corporate world, there was always talk of legacy, of empires built, of fortunes left behind. But a real legacy wasn't money in bank accounts or buildings with your name on them. His real legacy was sitting there in front of him, 3 girls becoming incredible women who would use their lives to make a positive difference in the world. That he had built an impressive business empire, but it would eventually be forgotten, replaced by the next ambitious entrepreneur. But the impact he would have through his daughters, and through the people they would touch, that would reverberate for generations. That was the legacy that mattered, the only kind of immortality worth pursuing. Years later, when the triplets were accomplished adults, each in their chosen fields, they still kept the tradition. Every birthday, no matter where they were, they would gather to make a lopsided cake together. And they always remembered that 6th birthday when everything changed. When a humble nanny risked her job to confront an absent father. When a businessman finally woke up before he permanently lost everything. It was a story they told without shame, without embellishing the difficult parts. A story of neglect, transformation, and hard-won redemption. It wasn't a fairy tale with a perfect ending. It was a real human story, imperfections and all. But it was their story, and they wouldn't trade it for any other. Richard, eventually a grandfather to grandchildren he knew intimately from birth, used to say that he had woken up late, but not too late. That he was immeasurably lucky to have a second chance that many never get, and that every day since that transformative birthday, he had actively chosen to be present, not out of obligation, but from a deep understanding that presence was the most valuable present he could give. Sitting on the porch of the same mansion, much older, but infinitely wiser, he would look at the photos covering the walls, no longer displays of material wealth, but a gallery of real moments. First days of school, piano recitals, art exhibitions, graduations, weddings, births. A full life documented not by expensive photographers, but by genuine participation. And at the center of it all, framed with special care, was Claire's original drawing, the one she had made years ago, showing a family holding hands, the father's space finally completely filled in. It was a constant reminder of where they had started, of how close they had come to losing everything, and of how much every daily choice to be present mattered.